It's time to begin as we continue our mission of serving our beneficiaries. By the way, some of them are in the audience, which is good to see. I'm calling the meeting to order, and the first item then is to seek adoption of the proposed agenda. May I have a motion to that effect?
So,
And a second?
Second.
All in favor of adopting the agenda, say aye.
aye.
Opposed, say no. Okay, that passed. And then the next item is to act on the minutes of the previous two meetings. I will combine the two meeting minutes together unless there's opposition to that. So the motion would be that the commission approves the minutes for the June 2018 meeting and the September 2018 meeting as presented in the notes you've seen. Any comments on the minutes? All in favor of approving, say aye.
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 Opposed, say no. Thank you, that carries. We have with us some representatives from the Funston. Oh, sorry, yeah, I dropped down to Funston because I'm so eager to hear it. So let me go back to the 2019 meeting schedule, which the commissioners have had a chance to review and comment on. Any further comments or questions about about next year's meeting schedule?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do have a comment. I think what's proposed is fine, but I think we need some additions. I just think we need to spend more time on make time for more strategic decisions and reviewing the AIP quarterly. That's statutory. Some of it might be training. Deep dives into SIOP and AIP or investments, or there's just a lot of things that I think we should make additional time for. So, and that could be in the form of longer meetings or additional meetings. And we don't have to decide that now, but I think that's something we should do.
And Mr. Conn, I think that's a good point. And one of the things that I think that Jeff and I have been talking about is providing some, especially when it comes to the deep dive, some of the education sessions in regards to like asset classes and those types of things. Is trying to come up with a way of providing those opportunities in between meetings, so that and certainly it's up to the commission as to whether or not the commission will want to make that a kind of a voluntary or would actually want to do that as in a formal meeting. But we would be very interested in trying to schedule some time with the commission to provide those opportunities, because we certainly want to make sure that we're providing you as much education, information as we can. It's November now. We're not going to have another. Pursuant to the schedule, we're not going to have another meeting until February. So I think there's going to be ample opportunity within that time frame for us to do some of that.
Hello, this is Reynolds.
So, but yeah, we're cognizant of that, and certainly would like to work with the commission on providing those training opportunities in between meetings.
The only one, in fairness, that April meeting, potentially, because that's the one where the SIOP and the AIP, because that has a May 1st.
AIP has been
May 1st. We could consider maybe changing that to like a 2-day, right? Make sure we have ample time, right? You can always cancel the second day, but, right.
Allow a deep dive into the AIP.
Just because that's the one that from a statute perspective we're required to do, and yet it gets a little short shifted, I think, at times, right? Because the documents are, I know, kind of always a question, in part because the legislative thing sort of mixed issues that we didn't think they'd be. Right.
you maybe want to, given that, you know, that it may be, just throwing this out there, it may be more helpful to have the 2-day, given one, the length of time between this meeting in February, it may be more beneficial to have the 2-day in February and do a deep dive into the AIP, because I don't think you necessarily want to be kind of up against, if there's major questions or major things that you want to kind of deep dive into, I don't necessarily think you want to be up against the gun of the May 1st deadline in April. So that's just a suggestion that we could potentially add this additional day in February, and try to cover some more strategic topics, do some deep dives, and then certainly go through the proposed AIP, because we would be proposing it in February anyway. April is usually just the more kind of the second reading or the more cursory, approval of the AIP. So,
That sounds reasonable and good.
and like I said, we can always, if we want to do that, we can always cancel it the second day if we need to.
Further comments on the meeting schedule? Bill, would you like to make it an amendment to the schedule, or just a matter for further discussion?
Sure, I'll make a motion to, adopt the schedule as proposed, except to add, February 8th as an additional meeting date. February 8th, 2019 as an additional meeting date.
Okay, a discussion of the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
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 All opposed, say no. So the amendment passes. Now for approval of the meeting schedule as amended. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. So the amended meeting schedule passes and is approved. Okay, for the next item on the agenda, I'll ask Mr. Hancock to introduce that for us.
Mr. Chairman, we are pleased to have with us Rick Funston, and I'm sure Rick will introduce the members of his team here to go through their findings in regards to the statutorily required fiduciary audit. I would just like to say it has been it's a massive undertaking for us, when we work through the fiduciary audit as it is for the Funston Group. I could not be more pleased with the interaction between our agency and with Funston. It is, we approach this as an opportunity to collaborate and learn from a recognized group of experts who really have the experience, substantial amounts of experience as to what is best practice across the country that they've gleaned from the various pension funds that they interact with. We certainly have learned a lot through this process, and I'm just appreciative of the level of engagement that both of our entities have been able to enjoy throughout this process. And I look forward to the commission hearing their presentation on the report. Mr. Funston.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, Mr. Chair, and members of the commission. And we see many familiar faces around the table and in the room. We've met some of the new commissioners this morning, in addition to our discussions on the phone. We want to thank you, first of all, for the tremendous cooperation that we've had from the commission and from the staff in completing this our second review. And again, as we'll get into more detail, we found just a very significant positive change that has taken place since the last time that we're here. But before I get into that, I'd like to just perhaps ask each member of our team just to describe the area of scope for which they were responsible, just very briefly, just so that when the tough questions come up, I can deflect them to those people. Megan?
Hi, I'm Megan Jackson. I'm a partner at Reinhardt Berner Van Dermen, which is a law firm based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my practice is centered on fiduciary duties and private equity and hedge fund transactions. So with that background, I cover governance and fiduciary duties, as well as legal items and some investment process matters.
John Lukumnik, primarily responsible for investment operations and also a number of governance issues.
Good morning, Steve Harding. Been actually related to South Carolina for almost 19 years now, on and off. 19 years ago, the South Carolina retirement system hired Independent Fiduciary Services. I was part of that team. We came in and worked with Peggy and her team. I have 29 years working with public employee retirement systems and over a total of 35 years with investments. I'm a CPA. I was a CPA for 34 years. My license is inactive at this point. My focus on the engagement was limited to the technology area.
Good morning, I'm Ken Johnson. I was part of the 2014 team that was here. I'm formerly the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer at the Wisconsin Investment Board. Been with Funston for about 5-6 years. My areas of the report were the custody relationship, cost effectiveness measurement that you do through CEM, HR functions, and communications.
Thank you, Ken. Not with us today are Randy Miller and Keith Johnson. Randy was the project team leader on a day-to-day basis, and Keith was also with the same law firm as Megan. So having said that, go to the next slide here, see if I can multitask. We were selected by the Office of the State Auditor to conduct the 2018 fiduciary performance review, and as you know, we also conducted the one in 2014. And the primary purpose was to evaluate what progress had been made since 2014, but also to look at whether we found any other kind of opportunities for improvement. Just to kind of recap the bidding in terms of what things were like in 2014, we found at that time that the infrastructure had not kept pace with RSIC's investment strategies. The commissioners were involved in performing investment operations such as due diligence to the detriment of a more strategic focus. There were severe frictions that existed between the commission and the Treasurer's Office amid accusations of commission malfeasance. The legislative framework governing RSIC was highly fragmented with multiple unclear authorities, responsibilities, and accountabilities, and in some, the commission was in a bit of a crisis. Since that time, at that time, we made recommendations, 126 recommendations for improvement, with 5 real improvement themes. First was to reset the commissioner's focus on strategy and oversight, improve assurance and independent reassurance, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, to build trust and confidence, to clearly align fiduciary duties and responsibilities, build capabilities across the organization, and improve the custodial relationship. We're very pleased to report that significant progress has been made. 110 of our recommendations have been fully implemented. 9 are substantially implemented. Of the remaining 7, which have not been implemented, 5 are under the control of RSAC, and 2 still require action by the General Assembly. but nonetheless, very, very impressive progress. From what we saw as a troubled and difficult situation, RSIC is now stable, has strong leadership, effective governance, and capable staff and operations. As we recommended in 2014, the commission created and filled the position of CEO in 2015. And since that time, the CEO, I think, has been instrumental in leading the organization forward with clear direction and purpose, and has also been able to build effective working relationships with the General Assembly and with the Treasurer's Office. In terms of the first theme, which was resetting commissioners' focus on strategy and oversight, again, significant progress has been made. We see that the commissioners are more focused on oversight and the longer-term strategic challenges of the commission, and much less on the day-to-day investment execution processes. You also created a Human Resources and Compensation Committee and the Audit and Enterprise Risk Management Committee, and expanded their charters. You also complete an annual self-assessment process, and most investment decisions were delegated to the CIO in October of 2017. And relationships between the commissioners and the stakeholders have improved significantly. The second theme was to improve assurance and independent reassurance to build trust and confidence. The PIBA auditor, Clifton Larson Allen, conducts annual agreed-upon procedures and reports to the Audit and Enterprise Risk Management Committee. Their roles and responsibilities in the Internal Investment Committee Charter have been strengthened, detailed, and clarified, and the Commission now participates in the annual CEM cost-effectiveness benchmarking. Continuing that, there's been some progress in these areas, but we think there still needs to be improvement. ERM and internal audit and compliance have been combined into a single position, which is currently vacant. The internal audit activities are being outsourced and are under the direction of that combined position, and I think interim arrangements have obviously been made to cover for that. Currently, we see that there is no functioning ERM program, although significant management attention is being given to that. And although the Commission approved an ERM program back in 2014, really very little progress has been made. We would say that this is due to a couple of factors. One is there's been a lot of turnover in that position, and second, the complexity of the proposed ERM process being based as it is on COSO, which is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. We'll be happy to entertain any questions as we go forward on any of these other items. But I'll just stop there and ask if there's any questions about what I've said as preamble, and I'm going to turn it over to Megan.
I've got, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I've got one, sir. About, you mentioned that we have combined the ERM, internal audit and compliance, into a single position.
That's correct.
Is that, would you say that's a good thing, or is there too much work for one person to do all of that?
Well, that was a question we asked, and given that the way the position is configured and with the amount of outsourcing that has taken place in the standardization of some of the activities, it could be done by one person, or it could, in fact, be redistributed as, to other staff at the current time. The internal audit function is outsourced currently. The compliance function, I think, is currently managed by the Director of Operations, by the Chief Operating Officer, and the ERM function is not really functioning at this time. But I did raise the question as to whether it's doable, and it's potentially doable if you can find the person who can wear all of those hats. Yes, sir.
In that respect, give us an illustration of the best practice in that area.
Well, I would say one size fits one. Because right.
One size fits us.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, and we've written extensively on this topic, and we see a lot of different pension systems, and they're all, while they all have similarities and things in common, every circumstance is different. And so I would say, first of all, with respect to ERM, just by way of background, I used to be the director of governance and risk oversight services for Deloitte for a number of years, and I was responsible for their development of the ERM program. And I have to say that in probably 20 years of experience, I have not really seen a program that really works very well as an ERM function. Its complexity, it tends to become a bureaucratic kind of exercise on its own. So I would put that aside for the moment, and I would say that it probably fundamentally just needs to be built into the way the organization does its business, and I can expand on that if you wish. In terms of internal audit, for an organization of the size, it's not uncommon to have that outsourced. The compliance function, again, can be variously handled internally within legal or within another function. So I think you're handling it as best as you can right now, but I understand that position is vacant and that you're looking to fill that position. So we can expand on any one of those three things.
Maybe later.
Okay. Okay. Megan.
Okay, yep. So I'm going to expand on one of the themes that Rick mentioned, which is the alignment and clarification of fiduciary duties. And we've seen significant improvement on this front. In our 2014 report, there were 8 recommendations made to the General Assembly, and 6 of those were reflected in the Pension Reform Act, which was passed in 2017. The first of these is that fragmentation of fiduciary responsibilities has been reduced. There are fewer entities that have oversight or responsibility for RSIC. Previously, the Budget and Control Board was named as a co-trustee with PIBA and had fiduciary obligations to approve RSIC's purchasing policy, as well as the State Treasurer's Office was involved as the custodian of assets and was responsible for the custodial banking relationship. And since the passing of the Pension Reform Act, that's been much more streamlined. RSIC and PIBA were identified as co-trustees, and the successor entities to the Budget and Control Board, the State Fiscal Accountability Authority, and the Department of Administration were not identified as fiduciaries. And the responsibility for serving as the custodian of the trust assets and for managing the custodial banking relationship was moved from the Office of the State Treasurer to PIBA and RSIC, respectively. Another important change since 2014 is that RSIC now has more control over the assumed rate of return. Previously, the General Assembly was not required to consider key inputs from PIBA and RSIC, such as the experience study or the asset liability study. This created some conflict for the Commission, we felt, because the assumed rate of return, which it didn't control, could impact how the Commission considers asset allocation and investment risk appetite. But this issue was also largely addressed by the Pension Reform Act. Under the Pension Reform Act, PIBA and not the General Assembly proposes the assumed rate of return, and it's based on the recommendations of its actuary and also in consultation with RSIC, which is an improvement. PIBA's proposed assumed rate of return will become effective unless the General Assembly revises it or rejects it. And the Act also requires the assumed rate of return to be reset every 4 years, which implements another Funston recommendation. While these changes have given RSIC more control, we included in our report a recommendation that RSIC and PIBA continue to have more authority over the assumed rate of return, which we consider to be consistent with peer practices. Another important change since 2014 is the establishment of the CEO position. The Commission hired Mike in 2015, and then the legislature codified his role in the Pension Reform Act. And the Pension Reform Act really streamlined lines of authority and made it clear that the CEO is the chief administrative officer of the agency and has the duty to carry out the mission and the policies of the Commission. The Pension Reform Act also addresses the relationship with the CIO. Previously, there had been some confusion because both the CIO and the COO reported to the Commission, which created some confusion. So they clarified that in the Pension Reform Act. Another important change is that RSIC is now allowed to engage outside counsel without having to get the Attorney General's permission. Previously there was some delays caused because RSIC had to go to the Attorney General for approval, and the Pension Reform Act created an exception to that process. So now for investment management decisions, that outside counsel can be retained without separate approval. There's just reporting requirements. Another important change is that the commissioner qualification criteria have been expanded. RSIC had very difficult to meet qualifications for commissioners, and that was expanded to include criteria that were more practice-oriented. So there were additional criteria for CPAs and chartered alternative investment analysts, and also those with experience managing pension funds or insurance plans. And the Pension Reform Act also implemented a few other pension Funston recommendations, including adding a 7th voting member and establishing term limits. So despite these changes, there were a couple areas where Funston thought that there could be additional progress made, and one of those is the control over its own budget. RSIC has responsibility for investing the trust assets, but does not have independent authority to build the infrastructure or hire the employees that are necessary to invest those assets. And although RSIC requested budgetary authority from the General Assembly, the request was declined. And so some of the risks that we identified in the 2014 report still remain, which is the limited ability to recruit and retain talented investment staff as opportunities arise, and also limited flexibility to obtain investment management systems. So our recommendation on that is to continue to engage with the General Assembly to request budgetary and personnel authority. And the General Assembly can seek other ways to oversee RSIC, such as fiduciary reviews and also active monitoring. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ken.
Great. Any questions before we pass the mic? Any questions, Megan? Okay. Ken?
So one of the overriding messages of 2014 work was that, particularly given the stress that the organization was going through, attention needed to be elevated on HR functions, and a person was needed to really lead the planning and the management of that, someone who would have a direct relationship with the CEO and with the Human Resources Committee. And some of the topics that I think we felt needed addressing were just more focus on employee development and training, revisiting the compensation plan, and taking a fresh look at staffing, particularly if you wanted to proceed with the expansion of internal management. And I think we can say with confidence that a lot of attention, a lot of improvement has happened in all of those areas. Really, all of those boxes have gotten checked over the last couple of years. And where we notice it particularly is just in the comments we've had in interviews with employees and commissioners about the level of stress and the improvement in morale is noticeable. So we think that the HR function has really been effective in supporting the organizational development needs that we saw. And it speaks well to the development of employees that you filled 3 significant senior level positions over the last couple of years from within, which requires there be some updating of the succession plan for those positions. And we also think it would be a good idea to have a conversation with the staff maybe annually about not only the plans for those senior positions, but to take a look at the state of succession readiness throughout the organization and steps that were being taken, getting a good idea of where people are in their careers and how close they are to retirement. Not that you need to be involved in the individual decisions, but just to get some reassurance that there is a plan in place to do that. We talked a lot in 2014 about your interest in proceeding with more internal management, which would have required a significant increase in staff and systems, probably would have required that you bring back some of the outsourced functions that you do for accounting and IT internally. And as you know, since then, you decided to make no immediate step in that direction. And so that has kind of been relieved as an issue for the time being. We did take a look at the staffing that you have now versus what you had before. You've added more positions. A couple of benchmarking reports have seemed to confirm that where you are staffing-wise now is about where you need to be for what you're trying to do now. And the message we clearly got from staff was they were comfortable with what you have. So for the future, I think outside recruitment remains a challenge, compensation being a big factor, and that'll need to be watched pretty carefully. Questions?
Pass the baton. In the administrative area in 2014, we pointed out a need to enhance the capabilities of the commission. And there were primarily three focuses, overall administration, investment risk analytics, and also in HR, which is basically part of admin. And the commission has made great progress in those areas. It's implemented some additional mechanisms in the admin area, such as the IT Steering Committee and the Business Internal Investment Committee. These two committees help to move the progress along the goals, the strategic goals that the commission has, and also in completion of the recommendations that Funston made back in 2014. So that's a great thing that's going on. And staff has paid close attention to those observations and is pretty consistent in making progress on those. They're looking at the relationship, for example, with the custodian and the systems that can be provided through the custodian. And I believe recently they've still made some decisions in that regard in terms of risk analytics. In terms of the recommendation we made 4 years ago on the infrastructure plan, we think there's still some work that needs to be done, and the commission agrees with this. They've in fact made this a focal point after their self-assessment. So we're encouraged by that. The focus on the future is key, and having a plan that serves as guidance is essential. And so this is an area where we've, again, recommended and suggested and encouraged the commission that they focus on this.
We should have been more thoughtful about passing the baton on our seating arrangement.
So point 5 gets to the custodial relationship. When we were here last, you lack the authority to select and manage the custodial relationship, which is unusual. I don't think we know of another fund that we've worked with or another investment organization like yours that was in quite the same position. And this is a relationship that's so critical to just about every aspect of your operation, so something that need to be addressed. As it was, we found things were somewhat cumbersome and inefficient. The boundaries of authority and accountability between the state treasurer's office and yourselves were unclear, and that caused some issues on both your side and for the custodian. The new statute passed by the Assembly designated the PIBA as the custodian of the trust fund assets and made RSIC responsible for the banking relationship. That's a significant improvement, and in our conversations with staff and trustees, I think there's a general feeling that the new statute is working well, and that the relationship is also working well from both the standpoint of the bank and yourselves. And because of that, you're now able to consider doing things through the custodian that you were not did not find easy to do under the prior arrangement, and kind of avoided that as an option. So now you have a broader set of options for doing a lot of things that you can use the custodian to do. I think for the future, one of the things we suggest is that there is additional level of service level agreements and monitoring that can be done just to provide reassurance about who's responsible for what's being measured, and to kind of score things to make sure you're on the same path. That's not yet something that all pension funds do. It's kind of a leading practice, but one you might want to think about.
Great, thank you. Any questions of Ken on the custodial relationship?
I have one, just kind of on what other funds are doing. I mean, I know part of our operational due diligence that people are looking at is looking at the sub-custodial relationships that offshore funds and stuff might have. But, you know, when you're at Wisconsin or other plans, I mean, how many of them are bringing up a formal report, say Risk and Audit Committee, on sub-custodial relationships, right? Because the bank is just kind of at that fund level, but, you know, when you kind of drill down into, all right, where, you know, here's the fund, it's on your balance sheet from a books and records standpoint, but really your money at the end of the day is sub-custodied out to a fund structure, right? And looking at those vendor relationships, right?
Yeah, I can comment, I think from Wisconsin's standpoint, I don't recall much attention being paid to the sub-custodian relationship or even the custodial relationship for that matter, unless there was an issue. So it's probably an area that more needs to be done.
One comment from a different perspective. I'm on the board of a 40 Act mutual fund. And the SEC has put forth a lot of emphasis on the need to understand the quality controls of your contractors and subcontractors. And one of the things that we have done in our due diligence, and I see no reason why it shouldn't be able to be done elsewhere in places that are not necessarily ruled by 40 Act, but have the same sort of needs, is when we go in to see the custodian, we ask what they have done on their diligence of the subs. We've asked for confirmations, ISL certifications, and other things that happens, and we want to be comfortable with their diligence process around the subs, because obviously we're not going to send someone to 130 jurisdictions around the world. It's not cost effective, but we do rely on them. But we ask the question and we get their certifications and understand the custodian's diligence process.
Any other questions on the custodial relationship? Very good. Well, now we go to treating it like a normal organization, as opposed to one that might have been considered in intensive care at the time. We have now looked at your organization and we have made what we would consider to be a set of recommendations consistent with those that we would make as being part of a continuous improvement process of how do you get better at what you're already doing without proposing really a significant major change. And I think it's a real credit again to the commission and to the staff that you've been able to make as much progress as you have in the last 4 years. It's really a night and day situation, and I'll comment on that more in just a moment. First of all, we want to recognize that the General Assembly, delegated the authority. First of all, that these recommendations would be going forward, as Megan mentioned, that the General Assembly should delegate authority to the Commission for budgets, staffing, and compensation. And even if they were not to grant whole authority, that even increasing the limits, I think, would be extremely helpful to the organization. We're also recommending that there be an exemption for the state procurement policy for direct investment support services, and also consider fully delegating the responsibility for setting the assumed rate of return to PIBA and to RSIC. The next point as well is that there was some concern expressed that when commissioners' terms expire, that close attention should be given to the timely appointment of successor commissioners and not leave vacancies on the commission. I'll turn it over to John now to speak to some of the specifics around investment.
Thank you. Since I didn't have the mic for any of the initial part, I also just want to congratulate everyone. It really is night and day. The investment operations in particular have definitely been routinized around a very functional and effective internal investment committee. Had occurred in a relatively short period of time. I didn't push anything. That's why he does the technology.
Yes, thank you. To talk about a framework over a 3 to 5 year period of looking at what the policy agenda might be, and also to align commissioner education sessions with those strategic initiatives so that the commission feels fully briefed as any of those issues come up. Secondly, we believe it is best practice to do asset liability studies every 3 to 5 years, not annually. The issue with doing annually is you wind up generally in overreacting to recent events. Moreover, there's an implementation lag because as you change the asset allocation for a fund this large, it is hard to get fully invested proportionally to the asset allocation over 1 year and just in time to change it again. So what we generally advise and what the academic literature shows, and the commission obviously, one of the other positive changes was the commission has selected an investment consultant just for the commission, and feel free to discuss this with them. I am sure they will have their own opinion. We generally find that a 3 to 5 year cycle allows you to deal with changes in the capital markets, while at the same time not in effect moving around the allocation that quickly and having a more strategic focus. Obviously, if there are changes either to the benefit structure through legislation or to the capital market structure, as there was in 2008, the commission is free to review it, but as a routine matter, a 3 to 5 year period. That also happens to dovetail nicely with the 4 year setting of the assumed actuarial rate. So one thing to think about. Rick has already spoken about onboarding and education, so I will give that a little bit short shrift. And the other issue that came out in some of the interviews was a desire to understand the other ways, the added ways in which the consultant to the commission, the investment consultant to the commission, could provide extra training and information, specifically as it is related to upcoming issues in an advanced time period. And one reason to have this strategic policy agenda is to allow those education systems to align. The Rick has already talked about ERM. I went the wrong way, didn't I? Sorry. Yep. Okay. Rick has already talked about ERM, so we will move on from that. The self-assessment process is always fraught, I would say, because we all like to think that we are honest in our self-assessments and understand what is going on, but sometimes we have to raise uncomfortable issues in private and executive session, so that the workings of the commission can improve in a continuous improvement process. So there are some recommendations in there about how to do that. Similarly, Megan has talked about securities litigation and ethics policies. One of those that we will get to later that I would specifically like to mention is extending the ethics policies fully to all your contractors. There was one gap. We are particularly sensitive to it because one of your fellow public pension funds wound up in the pages of the Wall Street Journal in a way you don't want to be, around broker corruption. The one place that you do manage money internally is on the short-term desk. You have appropriate ethics policies and disclosure for your employees, but you do not ask the brokers to affirm that they abide by your ethics policies. And that seems to us an easy fix, and I understand that is going forward. The ERM program, I think Commissioner Hancock, I believe it was, had questions earlier about. We can talk more about it. There are different ways to do it. We really do believe, however, that it needs to be integrated into the goals of the commission and the staff, as Rick said, as an enterprise performance management program, so that it is not an exercise in compiling lists of threats and probabilities that don't somehow integrate into what the CEO, the CIO, and the team are doing every day. It needs to inform that rather than be separate from it. I mentioned the broker-dealer selection policy. The template IMA should incorporate the SIOP. That is, again, a belt and suspenders approach. The IMAs are fairly good now, but it would be helpful to have the managers understand at a higher level what the higher goals are of the commission. The succession plan was mentioned in terms of senior management. I want to mention it in terms of lower, although still relatively high investment management staff. The good news is your succession plan worked. Lots of people have been promoted. The bad news is that means it's now out of date and there are holes in it. And so, again, I think that it is not necessary for the commission to write the succession plan, but to hold the staff accountable for making sure there is one that is kept up to date. And as Steve mentioned, our understanding is that there, in fact, is a new risk investment management system that is being, or a decision made on a risk investment management system. I don't know if it is public yet, so I would prefer not to state in public session what is going on. I will also congratulate the staff on its change in focus around investment risk management. At the time when you were thinking about going to internal risk management, without getting too jargony, there was a lot of focus around risk systems which related the risk of individual securities to each other. With the move towards not doing that and having primarily an outsourced plan, the staff, I think, the investment staff, I think, is appropriately focusing on what we call total plan risk, right? Which is a much lumpier but more powerful view of the world. What does liquidity risk mean, as opposed to what's the correlation of a specific security to another specific security? There are, overall, the due diligence and monitoring is fairly robust. We have made suggestions in the report. We can go through any of them if you'd like, in terms of due diligence and monitoring improvements. This is here because it is a continuous improvement process. I do not want to leave anyone with the impression that the due diligence and monitoring at the moment is substandard. It is, as I said, fairly robust, but obviously there are always improvements that can be made. Yes.
And going back to the Alan's question about sub-custodians, and you had some suggestions that some other people are doing, is monitoring or sub-custodians part of our existing due diligence, ongoing due diligence, or initial due diligence?
I do not believe it is. Ken looked at but selecting the custodian was a fairly robust process. So in the initial selection, I don't know what was done.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, we underwrite all the vendors and the custodians used by our managers. We sometimes don't go to the sub-custodian level, because if you select, say, Morgan Stanley as a prime broker, they could select Citibank Taiwan or Taipei office. So we don't go that granular. So that's your question, but we look at, collect stock ones.
Thank you. I know the commission is sensitive to fees paid to managers, particularly in private equity and private assets. The staff is developing, as you know, a co-investment program. In order to expand that co-investment program, perhaps to some other asset classes such as private debt, real estate, there may be outside expertise and support needed. So we have suggested that that might be a dollar well spent to find out what is needed, because fees in those classes are fairly high. Side letter prioritization, there are side letters, there's a template, but there hasn't yet been a prioritization of the particular issues in terms of negotiation. We understand there is a RFP undergoing now for additional outside counsel, which, as Megan said, will speed up some of the process in terms of partnership investments. Ken mentioned the need to pursue a service level agreement with the custodian. And Steve mentioned the IT plan. So I will now turn it back over to Rick for a summation. Thank you. Any questions on other aspects? Yes.
You mentioned the co-investment program and the need to hire third-party external help. Are you saying that because that's just best practice, or did you see something actually concerning with the co-investment program that would make you want to?
There was nothing concerning with the co-investment program. It is not yet done in those asset classes. And there is a need for both platform and underwriting expertise as well as bandwidth if you were going to expand co-investments to things like private debt or real estate, where you would want to have both a process and expertise, because obviously those are big lumpy investments. And so what best practice has been is to have what people call a spring-fed pool of consultants, where you don't pay anything unless you use them, but you have pre-qualified them through an RFP process and they have specific expertise.
Thank you.
John, would you see that as in addition to like a, if we have a co-investment partner in those asset classes, would you see that in addition to that, or do you think that would be, that if you have a co-investment partner, that you would get that?
Well, you have a co-investment partner now in private equity. And in effect, that is, you've combined the platform and the expertise in one co-investment partner. So as long as you get the platform and the expertise, the form is less important, let me put it like that. So this is mostly because you have dealt with it in private equity, but the goal, again, long-term, not this year or necessarily even next year, is to expand it to other asset classes. And we do not believe that that co-investment partner was selected for the expertise in those asset classes.
So basically look for more asset class specific expertise when you're looking for outside assistance.
We were looking at ways that we could facilitate the expansion of the co-investment, because our experience, and Ken can talk to this more if you want to go into depth, with CEM and others, is that is the place that public pension funds save the most money in terms of fees. And so if you are going to expand it into other asset classes, obviously you need the platform and the expertise.
It's also where you would see the most economic benefit.
Right, exactly.
As well, because it's becomes it's economic at that point rather than just a non-economic fee saving.
It's totally driven by the economics.
Yeah, it's accretive to return.
Well, that concludes our high-level summary. And again, we have more detailed recommendations in the report, but these are really the summary of the recommendations we've made. And I would just like to say, again, we cannot emphasize enough how impressed we are with the progress that's been made by the commission and by the staff. You're stabilized, you're professional, and our recommendations, again, are all along the lines of continuous improvement and moving to leading practice as opposed to address what we might see as being deficiencies. And again, the General Assembly is to be lauded for the governance framework, which is significantly improved from what it was. And while we've identified opportunities for improvement, again, I would say that's what one would expect in a normal operation, that you're always looking to get better. And we've certainly had a tremendous cooperation, again, from the commissioners and from the staff, and a very willing kind of acceptance of our recommendations, some constructive pushback in some areas, and requests for clarification. We've also worked with the executive to help develop an implementation roadmap that lays out, if you accept these recommendations, then what should be done, who should do it, and by when, similar to the roadmap we provided the last time. So we sincerely hope that this will be helpful to you as you continue to progress. But congratulations to everyone, most sincerely. And any questions of us?
Well, you did mention that there were 7 items that still needed to be addressed, I believe.
Yes.
could you just highlight what you would regard as top priority items that uh, should be addressed immediately or in the very near future?
Well, two of those were to the General Assembly around the procurement process and budgetary control. Of the five that are remaining, John, do you have those handy in terms of, do you recall what they are?
I don't, but two are in the process of being addressed, the risk system and the RFP for outside counsel. There,
I can speak to one other one after you. Go ahead. One of the ones that we were concerned about was the lack of progress on the ERM program. And if you'd like, I can expand on that if you wish.
Yes, on the ERM, my concern is that it not, as you mentioned, that it not be just a bureaucratic, process-driven item in our business, but that what's done in the ERM spills over into the decision-making and the analysis of the organization. So what can be done to prevent it from becoming just bureaucratic?
Well, it's a great question. It's one, frankly, that I wish more organizations were asking, because for the most part, what we've seen, it does tend to become a bureaucratic exercise, particularly when you adopt a framework such as COSO, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. It's not that what they're suggesting is wrong. It's just that it just becomes overly complicated. And I think the fundamental issue that we wrestle with is that it tends to separate the discussion of risk from the discussion of performance. And so we've written about this and spoken to and recommended to organizations that perhaps rather than an ERM program, an enterprise risk management program, what you ought to have is risk intelligent management program, so that it actually becomes part of the way you do business, much the way that it is being operated today. It is built into what you're doing. You don't have separate reporting on that, but I think there's a fundamental premise that one has to accept, which is that performance and risk are inseparable. They are both sides of the same, two sides of the same coin. And if you define risk as the potential for an unacceptable difference between actual and expected performance, then that applies to a wide range of things, whether it's strategic, tactical, or investment. So I would say that building it in rather than bolting it on is the key, tying it directly to performance metrics. And we've made some very specific recommendations. We were quite prescriptive about this to try and avoid you going down the path of the inevitable bureaucratic trap of having this being just a paper generating mill and an annual form filling exercise every year, which is what we've tended to see elsewhere. So building it in is critical, and making it part of your performance management system so that key performance indicators and key risk indicators are essentially one and the same. Once a key performance indicator goes out of whack, it's a risk indicator. And the question is, how do you bring it back under control? So, I mean, obviously, we can go into much more detail about that, but I would urge you to consider building it into what you're currently doing rather than treating it as a separate exercise, which tends to become, as I said, bureaucratic. Yes, sir.
Would it be more, would it increase its effectiveness by having a stronger and a more direct relationship between that committee and CEO?
Well, I think the de facto, the chief executive officer is the chief risk officer. And so essentially, Mr. Hitchcock is responsible for performance and risk in every respect of the organization. The question is how is that measured and monitored and reported? And we've made some very specific suggestions about how that might be done. But I think that's the key. That's your single point of accountability. And that's where kind of the buck starts and stops. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, okay.
I've got a
Yes, sir.
couple of questions. One is I think somewhere near the back, but talking about the audit committee along with this ERM, IA, and compliance position. all three of the, whether it's one person or three persons or two people that do those three functions, that, should they all report functionally to the audit committee?
The question is a great question, and I'll just kind of qualify my answer by saying, first of all, it is management's responsibility to provide the board and its committees with reasonable assurance that it is doing what the board has directed within the policy limits that it has established. And so that's basically the trust element of it. The trust but verify element comes from other sources that are independent of management. So independent investment advice, external audits, internal audits, and so on should be independent of operating management. Now, it is because they're part of an organization, they often administratively report internally, but we believe that the internal audit function should report directly to the audit committee of the board.
But out of those three functions, ERM, IA, and compliance, are you saying only the IA internal audit function really needs to report to the?
No, they all can be seen as independent reassurance functions.
Yes,
and
okay.
so therefore they could all be seen as having a reporting relationship to the committee.
Okay, thanks.
And through to the board. But that's why, and again, there are other sources. This review, for example, is a source of independent reassurance from a third party that is not connected to management. And that's, again, another source for you to judge it by. And the external audit is the same.
And one other thing, just to seek some clarification, and it deals with one of your recommendations, continuing recommendations that this commission be more strategic. When I read the executive summary, I kind of maybe assumed that the board already is a lot more strategic. We are more strategic, but a lot more.
Yeah.
But then when I saw the examples given in the executive summary, you know, we adopted some beliefs in 14. Well, what we did 4 years ago doesn't give me a whole lot of comfort now.
Right.
And then we approved an asset allocation in 18. Our own investment advisor or investment consultants called that a modest modification. So it wasn't a big change. So I think, and then I think what we've really done is kind of freed up ourselves to be more strategic.
Yes.
We're not really that strategic right now. And I think that's, and I'm just trying to make sure I'm going to confirm what you're saying. When we go to the recommendation on 10 and 11, you talk about a self-assessment, would create a more productive discussion on how the commission can become more strategic. We should develop a long-term strategic policy agenda. So would you agree, you know, we freed up some time, but the real focus is now how do we become strategic? And the real practical question is, can you give us the framework, and maybe that's part of the implementation framework you were talked about. What's the framework in how we really become strategic?
Great questions, and a number of statements in there which I agree with.
Okay, and I just wanted to make sure I'm reading it correctly.
You are, and I think you have gone from being quite tactical to being more strategic. Can you become more strategic? And in your thinking, the answer is yes. I think one of the things that, and this is very topical that you raised this, we're dealing with another client right now who is wrestling with the same issue, many are. If you think of looking out, say, 5 years from now, what kind of defensive and offensive capabilities does the organization require in order to be able to deal with the environment, with the volatility that we're seeing, with that kind of, what kind of capabilities do you require? And start to think about, well, when you think about the asset allocation, start to again think longer term. That's what John was saying, try to smooth out rather than doing it on an annual basis, start to look at a longer term perspective. What we would suggest when we were referring to the policy agenda is, let's say, identify what are the policy decisions that only the board can make, only the commission can make these decisions. The powers that we would say are reserved exclusively for the board. And there are typically four that we refer to. The first power that's exclusively reserved for the board or for the commission is to set strategic direction and policy. The second one is to approve certain key decisions. The third one is to conduct certain activities, including the evaluation of the CEO and a self-evaluation. And the last one is to oversee prudently delegated authority. So when you look at those and try and calendarize those four powers reserved exclusively for the board, relative to the investment decisions and the organization's capabilities, what are those strategic decisions and when do they occur, and how can you prepare yourselves for being in the best informed position to make that decision by the time the decision is required? And work your way back from that through a strategic thinking process. Unfortunately, too many strategic planning exercises end up being annual budget exercises as opposed to what are the kind of the issues that we fundamentally need to deal with. And dealing with strategic issues is the hardest thing to do. Dealing with tactical issues is much easier and therefore generally much preferred. So you're taking on a much more strategic role by looking at what are the policy decisions that are required that only the commission can approve. And we've written some further pieces on that. I'd be happy to share that with you as they become available. Yeah, no, but again, that's the right line of questioning. Are we being strategic enough? And what are our critical dependencies? What are our critical assumptions? All plans are based on assumptions. Too often, those assumptions aren't regularly challenged.
So you mentioned, I think, maybe an annual meeting to kind of go through that process, a strategic planning meeting. Is that something you would recommend?
I would think if you can look at, well, what is the policy agenda, the policy decisions that are required of the commission this year, the year after, and of course, in terms of your asset liability management and so on, then you might be operating on a 4 or 5 year cycle. What are the decisions in the cycle? One of the first one, as you said, might be, let's revisit our investment beliefs, which were set 4 years ago. It's time to review those now and think, given the changes in the composition of the commission and so on, is it time now to look at those and see whether those beliefs are still valid, because they basically provide the policy framework upon which your investment programs are executed. So that would be thinking strategically, and then building a consensus and looking at how do you then move forward from that point. But that's exactly the right direction, I would suggest. Yes.
Basically a strategic calendar by which so you have these, I mean, first you have to identify obviously the commission needs to identify the strategic topics that it wants to visit or to be mindful of, or to weigh in on, but to establish a calendar by which those are regularly revisited so that you have these, you have this, a chance, an opportunity to review those on a regular basis and make sure that you're engaging in that, whatever strategic decisions are part and parcel of those items, that you're actually doing that on a regular basis.
That's exactly right. Set up that calendar on a rolling 5 year basis to say, these are the decisions that are going to be required, and then how do we then get the information in front of the commission in a timely basis so that they'll be in a position to then make an informed decision when the decision is due. Okay, and yeah.
Thank you for the comprehensive overview. It's very helpful. As you think about, the goal of kind of becoming more strategic and focused at the commission level, a two-part question. Are there specific things that you think the staff of the organization should focus on to help aid in that kind of a transition? And then secondly, are there common struggles that you've seen as kind of a board reframes its scope?
Yes. How much time do we have? In 30 seconds or less, and speaking in gusts of up to 1,500 words per minute, I think the staff have a critical role to play because in most organizations, policy is not developed by the commission or the board. It always comes forward from the staff. I think one of the things that needs to be done, though, to put the commission and the board in an informed position is to identify what's the issue, what's the background on this issue? What are the options that are available to you from the least you could do to the most you could do? What are the pros and cons associated with each of those options? What's been your due diligence process? How will this affect your various stakeholders? How have they been engaged in that process? And then what is the recommendation that you would bring forward? I would call that a policy brief. How do you prepare a policy brief so that, again, for communication purposes and understanding that you have those as part of that policy agenda? And then what I would call a program brief, which is for those areas we would call, for prudently delegated authority, how do you oversee that? Then I would say there's a program brief that gives you at a high level, here's the vital sign, here's how this part of the program is performing, and basically drill down from here if you want further information and handle that on an exception basis. What we see too often is that too many reports come forward. One organization we're dealing with right now, they receive 1,000 to 1,200 pages per month for their board meeting, right? And it's just, that's impossible. That's just, speaking technically, we call that a data puke. And so, so what happens is that you're just simply, you're overwhelmed by this. People, they don't want to look at it. Nobody wants to look at it, all right? And you're burying any signals in all of this noise. So the role of staff, I think, is to improve signal detection by reducing noise, increase signal strength, and improve pattern recognition, and then identify what are the policy implications of the patterns that we're seeing, okay? And that's my 1,500 words per minute.
Are you trademarking data puke? Okay.
You just heard it first right here.
Jeff, I would just add, concretize something Rick said, or even more. Staff is dealing with tactical shifts in the environment in which the functions are carried out all the time. In your field, I just gave a talk about the use of artificial intelligence to look at unstructured data crossed with smart beta exposures to create a robotic portfolio. And why do you need a portfolio manager anymore? Right? I mean, so that's not something that I would think as a policy level you would want to be reacting to every day. But if you're doing a strategic planning initiative and you think this is a long-term shift in the capital markets, or another example, just the proportion of the U.S. capital markets that's private versus public, I would think that in preparation for your next asset allocation, those sorts of day-to-day tactical things that you're dealing with as staff, what I would call the environment in which the policy needs to be made, can be brought up and slowly built out as an educational into a policy to ultimately react in a policymaker commission decision when that decision needs to be made. The key to this, as Rick said, is to understand that 3 years from now, we have a decision to be made around X, and then for the staff to say, what's changing in the environment that's affecting how we want to think about that decision, and put that forward as a policy brief to the commission.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, one, just kind of going back a little bit to the ERM, when we discussed this in the past, you said focus on the output and then focus on kind of, how bad can it get? How fast can it get that bad?
Yes.
How fast can it recover? What sort of mitigating actions? Who's doing that well, right, in the public pension fund space that y'all have seen? And then secondly, are we thinking about it wrong in terms of, back to the bureaucratic question of it being a position, rather, do we make it part of the annual risk assessment and have those division heads come in and say, all right, here's your brainstorming exercise, answer these kind of 3 big risk questions for the board on operational. You have your legal come in, you have your investment team come in, you have your business line people come in and just do that with the board.
You phrased it exactly as I would have phrased it in terms of the critical questions. And I think the critical questions need to be asked of the accountable managers, not a separate function. Too often what happens is that ERM will come in and they will present their risk assessment. And management will sit around and go, well, that may be your risk assessment. That's not necessarily my risk assessment. what I would suggest is that management be directly held accountable for their management of performance and the assessment and management of the related risks, and they be held accountable for that and to present to you their assessment of here's where we think performance could go off the rails, and here's what we're doing to prevent it. So I would strongly endorse the latter. Which is rather than have a separate function, build it right into the way you hold management accountable. And with another organization we're dealing with right now, that's exactly what they've done. They've adopted a system that's called Enterprise Performance Management. And they identify what's on and off track and how much variability is acceptable in performance. And if it turns yellow or red, then the accountable executive stands before the board or sits before the board and gives them their explanation of why there's a variance and what's being done to bring it back under control and whether additional resources are required. But that would be the kind of the accountability piece of it. And the first part of it is there are tremendous problems with using likelihood as a way to assess risk. And so what we're recommending is that, because it typically results in an over or underestimation of the risk. And so we would suggest, what's your biggest risk and how vulnerable are you and how quickly can you recover is all of the critical dependencies. Those are the things you really need to be answering the question and having your executives and management respond to that.
Rick and colleagues, thank you very much for your report and for all of your work on this. And I have to say, as someone who was a new commissioner at the time you were organizing the first report, I'm glad to hear you say that we've made impressive progress. And I believe that a good part of it is due to your work and then to the leadership since then in the commission. So thank you very much.
On behalf of our entire team, we're gratified to have been part of your progress. Thank you.
Make one recognition on our side. I too want to thank you for everything that the level of engagement that we've been able to achieve. Like I said at the beginning, on our side of the kind of the table, it has been a tremendous effort on all of our staff to work through the audit and obviously and it will be as I've said, I'm looking forward to us implementing the recommendations the new recommendations that we've been provided. But I would be remiss if I didn't, although it is certainly has been an effort by the entire staff, I would be remiss if I did not extend special recognition to Andrew Chernick. He has definitely been, sometimes I think I want to change his title to Chief Funston Officer, Operating Officer. If I had
If it wasn't a conflict, we'd hire him.
If the fund had $1 for every time he has used the word Funston in the past 4 years that I've been here, we would be well on our way to addressing the unfunded liability. So, he is, in his ever evolving or changing hat of hats that he wears, he has been undoubtedly the engine, the consistency, the connective tissue of us being able to respond as well as we have to the Funston recommendations. So I just wanted to, like I said, I'd be remiss if I didn't extend a special recognition to Andrew. So
Thank you, Andrew.
We heartily endorse that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bless you.
Let's take a short break at this point.
Right on time.
Yes.
Audit and Enterprise Risk Management Committee report, Mr. Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This committee met for the first time since I've been seated back on October 24th. It was Mr. Condon, Ms. Boykin, and myself. And they selected me as chair, which I will that's an honor. When we talked about it, we determined that we're going to revisit the chair position on an annual basis as to make sure that we've got fresh eyes and fresh legs when it needs to be looked at and run hard. Compliance update. We received an update on the routine parts of it. The 9/30/2018 reviews are still in process. We'll have that update for next meeting. It was given on, Mr. Chairman, give us some, updates on the manager compliance questionnaires. We received 100% response rate, which is good. And, the investment staff and the compliance staff, they reviewed all of those responses. Switching gears to internal audit. We received updates from the fiduciary performance review. We received a copy of the initial draft, and we're still contemplating that. We had an agreed upon procedures engagement formed by our auditors, Clifton Larson Allen, and it's listed out very specific procedures and the results of those procedures for us. And now we were notified that we are now in compliance and carry the GIPS verification, which is the Global Investment Performance Standards. The year ended June 30th, 18. We were ACA Performance Services who conducted that, issued the report, and the verification and performance examination including testing around such areas as valuation, composite construction, account returns, compliant presentations, and policies and procedures. We plan to have this verification, performance examination, and resulting report done on an annual basis going forward. And finally, in that meeting, we proposed dates for 2019 meetings of our committee, March 5th, June 4th, August 27th, and October 29th. Those are coordinated to be with an appropriate time before each full commission meeting. And with that, I'll take any questions. Otherwise, that closes up my report.
Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, while I'm on the role of recognizing people and their significant actions, might as well keep going. The audit committee received the GIPS report on the GIPS verification. That really, just for the commission's education, that really is the gold standard of performance reporting. We are one of a handful of pension funds that have achieved that verification. I'm especially proud of that effort because that was not a top-down recommendation. That was a bottom-up recommendation from our investment performance and reporting team, and especially they did yeoman's work in working with ACA to get the verification. The idea was brought to us by John Rickner. So this is a functional element of the organization willingly taking on more work to provide a greater degree of transparency and assurance and confidence that as I've said, performance reporting, our investment performance, that's the most important thing that we report, that we communicate, and achieving that standard is, I think, something that we should all be happy that we've been able to do. And special thanks to John Rickner and his team for all their work in getting us to that point. So.
Thank you, John and team. The next item is the report of the Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Hitchcock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Other than the discussion and as you see on the agenda, there's an agenda item for discussing and approving the SIOP. I think we've had indicated back in June that we were going to try to make an effort at substantially improving and updating the SIOP. We did a lot of work on that, myself, Jeff Berg, and mainly Robert Feinstein led that effort over the summer. It was ready for us to discuss at the September meeting, but obviously the hurricane kind of caused that to be pushed to this meeting. I will say this is a fairly massive undertaking. This is a substantial document. We've made I hope that we have improved the document. But we have certainly changed it significantly. It doesn't and the changes that we made do not necessarily lend themselves well to following the changes in a track changes version. I know that there are, there's commissioners that I think would probably, from what I understand, would like to spend a little bit more time with the document, and having a little bit more time to try to review. I think it would also be helpful and incumbent upon us, at the staff level, myself and Jeff and Robert, to make ourselves available to any commissioner who would like to come in and do a little bit, or meet with us, do a little bit more of a detailed review, kind of side by side of the existing SIOP, and the changes that we're proposing. I think we are perfectly well suited with this being an iterative process. We don't, there's plenty of time for us to carefully consider the changes that we're making. Like I said, this is a foundational document. As a result, I would suggest that and also the statute does require us to review and approve this, either review and change it or reaffirm it once every year. We did that back in April, so we're within our 1-year timeframe. So what I would suggest is that recommend is that we carry this over, and allow us to, like, for the commissioners who would have questions and want to dive a little bit deeper into this, to give them an opportunity to meet with us, and make sure that, because the one thing that I want to make sure is, when you're working on a foundational document like this, you want to make sure that everybody's has time enough to consider it, that their opinions are considered, and maybe we can bring back some thematic topics for discussion, especially if we're doing like a 2-day February meeting, and have a little bit more robust discussion on some common themes at that meeting.
So, it's been recommended, by the CEO that we, carry this item over until the next meeting. And so I would ask if the commission would consider a motion, to carry over this to the February meeting.
So moved. Second.
Any discussion of the motion? All in favor of carryover, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say
Aye.
unanimous on carryover.
Mr. Chairman, just one other issue. There was some concern. There's a statement in the proposed SIOP that one of the things that we had not necessarily referenced in this, our statement of investment objectives previously was that meeting or achieving the assumed rate of return, listing that as an investment objective in the SIOP. In my proposed edits that I made, I included that, and included a statement where I thought that it basically says that the commission feels that over time, the 7.25% is a assumed rate of return, is achievable over longer periods of time. I think there has been a little bit of concern expressed about the inclusion of that statement, given, I think, some of the, back when we were doing the asset allocation, and kind of the probability analysis that we did on that. I think that would be a good topic of discussion for us to have now, not right this second, but I think that topic of conversation folds in well with the asset allocation framework discussion that we're going to have be led through in just a little while. So just to kind of, as a little bit of a precursor or segue, I think maybe we should talk about that when we're talking about the asset allocation framework, because I think that's one of those kind of foundational principles that I think we all need to have, some level of assurance and agreement on, that is something that we feel is achievable. So, but I'm not asking for any action on that. I'm just making that suggestion.
This is just kind of, can I make, just because I know we're bringing it up and we sort of proposed it, so I don't want to chew up a bunch of meeting time.
Sure.
Right, but I'd mentioned to Jeff, I appreciate that we put Makita's, risk return correlation assumptions, but and I know the table gets a little bit big, but the correlation table doesn't have all the assets that are listed in the return table, right? And I think it should, right? I mean, I think those two ought to have internal consistency, because I think it does help remind us on a couple of basic principles. And then I would like to see, more time spent on the rebalancing policy, right? Because this is statement of investment objectives and policies, right? And what I would ask staff to do is give that some thought of rebalancing within an asset class versus rebalancings between asset classes versus rebalancing for risk and policy related measures. But I would like to see a much more robust consideration given to what the rebalancing framework ought to look like.
Anything else from the CEO?
No, sir.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the report of the Chief Investment Officer, Mr. Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Somebody just asked me if my restraint thus far was a Christmas present to the commission. So in that spirit, I am going to forego specific comments at this time. I will be doing a plenty of talking for the remainder. So I would like to keep things moving and invite David King to provide our third, or I guess, fiscal first quarter performance update.
Morning.
Morning. So today I will be going through our September performance, fiscal year to date. And I posted a video kind of walking through our August performance for the full update. So we're going to do a very brief September update because we just got our new numbers in a couple of days ago. So looking at our fiscal year to date performance through September, the plan returned 2.34% versus a policy benchmark of 2.53, giving us a negative 19 basis points excess return. In that same period, we've paid out $458 million of net benefit payments. Looking at this in dollar terms, you can see the plan started at $31.3 billion. We paid out $458 million in benefit payments, and we've gained $721 million from investment performance. Just as an update, this year we paid out the rest of the Terry program. So fiscal year to date, of that net benefit payments, $373 million were from the Terry program.
Is that a one-time hit?
Yes. Yes.
So but will the elimination of that have any effect on annual benefit payments going forward? Or
Can you ask that slightly differently? I'm not sure.
Yeah, does the end of the Terry program affect our average benefit payment going forward?
Yeah. Yes.
So reduce it, increase it?
It'll reduce it. Right. It'll reduce it. Hey, what was the usual, like 200? I mean, I don't want to misspeak, but I mean,
we pay out about $3.3 billion in benefit payments. We collect about a little bit over $2 billion in contributions. So in a given year, we generally have a net negative cash flow of about $1 billion. The reason why you see so much of a Terry payout for this quarter is that Terry ended June 30th, 2018. So all of the people rolling out of Terry at the end of the program were paid out in this first quarter. So that money had been, from an accounting standpoint, the benefit payments were accruing, so it doesn't increase our benefit payments. It changes our cash flow, but from a financial statement standpoint, it doesn't change the amount of benefit payments that are due. Now they're just being paid to the individuals, which affects cash flow from the
liability was already there.
But the liability was already there because those benefits were being set aside.
If I could add the column next to it, the net benefit payments for 3 months, that's unusually low and is in recognition of funds that came in from the General Assembly as well. And I don't know off the top of my head.
That might have been
But
something
that's the
that triggered it,
one-time
because
money.
that did seem low.
There was about slightly more than $100 million coming from the General Assembly in this period.
Another reason I asked the question, and it might go to your later presentation, Jeff. Somewhere I just saw somebody comparing a ratio of negative cash flow to earnings, something like that. And so I was just wondering whether we expect, that just led me to think about the negative cash flows more, if that's gonna, if that ratio might improve, because maybe our benefit payments might decrease after Terry.
Yep. And the way I'd have you kind of organize that into a framework of how you think about it is if with higher ongoing cash flow needs, that needs to be your focus more.
Yes.
And when those are more subdued, you're able to adopt a bit of a longer term investment horizon to the way you think about managing your liquidity as well. So it's just, it's actually having the Terry program unwind. Of course, last year it was complicated and we had to reserve additional cash just to make sure we had adequate liquidity for that. On a going forward basis, having that not be kind of a complicating factor and the additional contributions coming in, through contributions.
Yeah.
These things are conspiring to take down our expected cash outflow each year, which is a nice opportunity for us. And it's something that, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, is a consideration as it relates to how we think about asset allocation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So moving on to our policy target allocation, and then the bars are the bands around that in our AIP. You can see that we're within all of those ranges and pretty close to those policy targets. Looking at our plan value in dollars over time, you can see we're off of our previous peak at the beginning of the year, but still $2.1 billion over the previous 2007 peak. Since RSIC's inception, we've paid out $12.8 billion in net benefit payments. Looking at our universe rankings, fiscal year to date, we're in the 60th percentile. And our rolling 3 years and 1 year is at the 82nd and 83rd percentile. This next slide is just our peer rankings from Bank of New York, showing the rolling rankings over time.
Question about that. I was struck a little bit by the dispersion range here, right? On the more recent years. Do y'all know what's driving that? I mean, that's a lot of dispersion among plans of this size.
I can show you what we believe are, how many are in the group, 36? Yep. Is that right? I can show you asset allocations for 38 clients that would fit in this category. I believe there are some plans that are very high in very conservative assets. And I don't want to comment on their unique circumstances because I don't know what, but I think you see that on occasion.
Just that
in
fixed
that data
income.
is,
Yeah.
I think there stands with, or plans with unique statutory limitations that kind of limit what they're able to do.
Yeah.
And I guess you could see the effect of that.
Yeah, and the reason why I bring it up, right, I mean, because even in the SIOP, right, we're talking about a peer group, and presumably this is the peer group, right? But if there's 1,000 basis point annual dispersion, right, across the 38 plans, something substantially different, right, within that peer group. So is that really what we don't understand what's driving that peer group? Is that a real target that ought to be showing up in our policy documents? And I know there's something we go round and round and back, right? But either that peer group really needs to be refined, right? Or we need to understand what's driving it, but that's 1,000 basis points range.
Yep.
Right.
And there is no single peer plan.
Right.
That's something that gets lost, I think. So
Yeah,
when we sit there and try to think, okay, where is this mythical median plan?
Mhm.
There is not a median plan. In the median in 1 year is not the median plan in 3, 5, or 10. So I mean, there's churn in that universe, and people move around a lot. So, but I think that this is a conversation. If we could, let's bring this up in about 15 minutes. It would be perfectly timed. When we talk through asset
In the
allocation.
asset allocation discussion, the asset allocation framework discussion, I think this is a perfect, topic to address.
David, I'd like to make a comment that I would like to see the reporting team consider putting in rather than the net benefits, put in both the benefits paid and the receipts as separate bars, because based on the question that was asked, showing it as net benefits sort of obscures what's really going on in the system and all the money us retirees are getting every year, every month. So just consider that as you think about reporting these things.
Okay, sure. And this concludes my prepared slides. I did want to give just a high-level update. October was a very rough month in equity markets. The equity was down almost 8%. So just our updated plan estimate for the month was down about 4%. So we're expecting our fiscal year-to-date return through October to be just a little bit north of -2%.
Which would be a little bit south of zero.
Any further questions for Mr. King?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are going to, apologies, I'm page 133. Okay, get up there. I'm actually going to let James come up, but we want to talk about some additional work that we think is appropriate to include on a going forward basis in the way that we approach the asset allocation process we employ. And I just want to be clear, at the highest level, our proposal is that you have us do more work, and to do this work alongside Makita. And we have been spending a great deal of time thinking about ways that we can that we can think about asset allocation. And right now, our process is really centered on the question of whether we can just kind of directionally improve upon our existing portfolio, which is not entirely a bad thing, but I think there are two shortcomings to this approach. First, the current portfolio is, by definition, is always the main reference point for judging any new portfolio, and I think inherent in that there's an assumption that it's right. I think that we want to ask ourselves, broader questions than just simply how do we nudge this from here. But this approach also doesn't do anything, in my opinion, in our opinion, to answer the question: what is the right amount of risk for a portfolio like ours? Or even is there a limit to how much risk we should take, given the unique characteristics of our plan? So we think that it makes sense to overlay this as a risk framework, what James is about to walk us through, and as a part of this framework, we would very much need to integrate our plan's unique cash flow characteristics, the understanding of the structure of the liabilities. What are the assumptions embedded in these liabilities? How do we observe changes in these? Also, contribution rates. How might contribution rates be changing on a go-forward basis? And if we're able to define the specific outcomes that we'd like to avoid, we can work to establish a portfolio risk limit that then becomes useful as a shoving off point for how do we think about different allocations. The framework we're proposing today is very flexible, and James will outline some of this flexibility. I personally believe this is the most powerful approach that we've come up with that creates a connection between the system's risks, our system's risks, and the asset allocation that we adopt. And I don't want to overstay my welcome since James is going to do all the heavy lifting. So I'll turn it over to James. Mike, did you want to add anything beforehand?
No, I mean, I just kind of echo when we think about asset allocation, I think we should be driving towards, given the unique characteristics of our plan, funded status, contribution policy, and all the other individual factors of our plan, what is the best asset allocation? If the goal is to ultimately get the fully funded, what's the best asset allocation for our plan? And how do we right size the risk associated with that asset allocation for our particular plan? And so, I mean, I think this takes us in a significant step in that direction. That's trying to really to refocus kind of our principles when it comes to asset allocation. So, James.
Yeah, no, thanks for the introduction there. I think, it was interesting that Funston spent so much time on sort of the strategic element of decision-making here. There's obviously nothing more strategic than the asset allocation decision for us. And so what we're really attempting to do here is have a better framework where we can more directly translate the risks that matter to our plan into our asset allocation decisions as we sort of think about and consider those. And specifically basing our asset allocation on those specific plan outcomes that we want to achieve with a view towards risk. So specifically, risk for us, we don't really view ultimately as tracking error, Sharpe ratio, or value at risk, et cetera, some of these traditional risk metrics. Risk for us ultimately is involved in the impairment in our ability to meet our obligations to our beneficiaries. So that's really where we want to focus on, and that's obviously incorporates unique risks for us. So let's talk about maybe two important objectives that we might have with respect to our plan liabilities. The first of these being, for example, a risk, as Mike mentioned earlier, the risk of becoming derailed from a path to achieve full funded status in 30 years. Say if that's a risk for us that we want to consider. This is a stylized plan here, but if you look at starting point here, sort of a baseline, if this is the forecast, starting from here and achieving full funding inside of 30 years, if you have a baseline expectation, what hypothetically would be a loss or a max loss that you could take and still avoid being derailed off of that path if you reverted to actuarial and investment assumptions from that point forward. So that might be a risk that we'd want to avoid. And you'd want to, I think, know that you were designing an asset allocation that had a certain probability of avoiding that risk. So let's take another risk that we could conceptually consider here, and take a risk of what we sort of referenced here, sort of a black hole effect that's a bit ambiguous, but it relates to cash flows as well as the market value and funded status of the plan. So this is risk really that we experience a loss great enough to cause net cash outflows to be an overwhelmingly large percentage of the plan. As you can see here, for example, if you take a 100% funded hypothetical plan here that has a 1% cash outflow as a percent of market value, and you take that plan through a stress scenario, say a 45% loss, that 1% becomes almost 2% of market value outflow. Take that same plan though, and say it's 33% funded and that cash outflow is 3%. That 3% can quickly become 6% and an overwhelmingly large percentage of the both market value as well as the expected returns of that plan, which can create a number of problems we can talk about. This risk combines variables of the plan, including both cash flow and funding status, and it can be characterized in a number of ways, but here we will characterize it, for example, as a line that we also might want to consider as a risk limit. So adding this to the additional risk limit we talked about could give you a hypothetical scenario that you want to avoid in terms of as you think about asset allocation. So this is just a very basic stylized framework that we'd envision to better relate our liability structure into asset allocation. It certainly remains an open question what specific risks that we value most and what risks we wish to incorporate into the asset allocation discussion. There's a number of risks that we can certainly incorporate. One of them, of course, being fully funded inside of 30 years and the path to that achievement. Also, the black hole scenarios we mentioned. We can also consider other risks, for example, the risk of having to raise contribution rates above what's already contemplated in the 2017 pension reform legislation. That can be integrated as well. Also the risk of, for example, a liquidity crunch or the need to sell illiquid assets at a haircut in a stressed environment for the plan would be another risk that we could consider as well. So the implications of this, we think, are, one, we need to reframe risk in terms of the plan's unique liabilities. Two, we really need to use and understand in our analysis a wide range of scenarios possible rather than simply focusing on one or two scenarios in the asset allocation question. Also, we need to incorporate a range of assumptions about our assets, our liabilities, and our plan structure into the analysis. So that's the sort of the stylized conceptual scenarios for the plan and conceptual framework. Let me, before I dig into sort of this framework envisioned for South Carolina and what this looks like for our plan, let me pause there if there's any questions on the concept.
Yeah, I guess I have one kind of on the black hole effect, right? I mean, two different scenarios. I'm just imagining it like that. One, just take the simple dividend paying something, right? Dividend gets cut, market keeps that same valuation, you get cut in half, right? Another one, just the market does whatever and it gets cut in half, but your cash flow is essentially the same, right? Just a kind of a repricing. Much different impact on my ability to sustain or maintain a program, right? Because in one of those, I got repriced because there was a decrease in cash flow. And the other one, I just got repriced on a multiple kind of basis because of the nature of my asset. And that may be a little bit more complex, but I just think, if we're going to look at things like that, we have to, really kind of tear into them a little bit.
And we'd love to. I think that the question is, how does the commission kind of come together to define the things that matter most from a downside mitigation standpoint? We have some ideas, but ultimately, it's not our ideas that make it happen. We need to, I think, embed these principles in the way we approach thinking about what should the portfolio look like. It's not only what do you hope to get, but how much pain can you inflict through your portfolio on the health of the system. So we need to, I think, be thoughtful not only about the upside, because the easiest thing in the world, on the tail end of a 9-year bull market, is to allow yourself to believe that more risk is a better thing all the time. That's the temptation. I think right now there's a timely aspect to having this conversation because things are still, by and large, pretty good. We should be figuring out, when the storms come, what kind of portfolio do we think we want to have? Not saying we need to make radical changes, but I think right now we don't have our process really focusing on what a reduction to funded status can cause. You know, triggers events. Peggy is very familiar with what that can trigger. You know, eventually we say we have to kind of go across the street and say, we need more money to make this work. And is that a logical limit to set where we don't want to have to do that? You know, I think there's a lot was asked of the plan participants and the employers. Can we ask more? You know, I don't know. But I think we need to be sensitive to the connective tissue between what we set as the asset allocation and in downside scenarios, how does that migrate back to other stakeholders? And what does that ask of others? Because I think, you know, we ran a portfolio that was low risk for a 4 or 5 year period of time when you could have been high risk and made a lot more attractive return. But the instincts behind that, I think, were because we didn't have this defined. And we had just gone through the financial crisis. So I think if we kind of bring that risk discussion more into the asset allocation discussion, and it's not just portfolio risk, system risk. I think it really strengthens and clarifies, frankly, for me, you know, what matters most. Because we do have kind of conflicting goals: avoid downside, get to fully funded. You know, there's a tension between those two, and then there's also the peer group. You know, how do you incorporate that into that tension? You know, is it a third stake, or, you know, it's not necessarily the clearest. So.
Yeah, so we have a framework that we've just proposed as a not a, you know, this is not a formal recommendation. This is just something that you know, is a framework that is certainly possible to be used in terms of the asset allocation decision, as Jeff mentioned. So, you know, first of all, if you move sort of to the bottom right here and you think about the different risks that we might consider as the plan, as the key plan risks. One is this achievement of 100% funded in 30 years, or really establishing a risk limit that prevents us with a certain degree of likelihood to avoid the risk of getting derailed from that path. The other risk here that we could contemplate is the risk of having to raise contribution rates beyond that provided for in the 2017 legislation. Also, this pay-as-you-go, or sort of, you know, we're calling that, you know, similar to the black hole scenario. That's a risk that, you know, ultimately, you know, we experience a loss great enough to cause the plan to sort of have that extremely negative cash flow profile. The liquidity crunch is also another risk that we could consider there. And you'll notice with each of these, it's not just, you know, do we want to avoid this? Obviously, we want to avoid all of these things, ideally with 100% confidence. But we can translate different asset allocations using our capital market expectations into the likelihood that we have of avoiding these things. For example, if we say, you know, we want to have a 90% confidence of avoiding this scenario here over the next 5 years, what this means, this confidence level, is that we would select a portfolio such that the sort of the 10th percentile or lower band of that outcome, or worst outcome, we would have a 90% confidence of achieving a better outcome than that. So over here also, we think we want to challenge the assumptions as well, not just be focused in on or overemphasizing a certain set of either capital market assumptions with respect to the assets or liability assumptions. And so we think we want to consider a range of outcomes there as well as different plan structure issues that could impact the plan over the next several years. For example, the assumed rate, if that moves or changes in the future, I think we want to incorporate that. So
I got a question.
Yeah.
The risk on the top right or bottom right there, 100% funded, 30 years. You know, we adopted an asset allocation back in February or something like that, I think it was. That basically was our same asset allocation, just minor changes. But, you know,
Said 52%.
yeah, probability of achieving 7.25% over 20 years, 52.1%. So did we not adopt a plan, kind of looking at it inversely, that says we're not going to be fully funded in we're not going to achieve, well, that says 20 years, we're not going to achieve 7.25% over the next 20 years as a 48% probability. So, and I guess I just wanted to throw that out now that, you know, we're a long way, it seems like, from having any significantly high confidence in being there. Now, even if we don't achieve 7.25% over 20 years, maybe we achieve 7%. I mean, you know, there's ranges. That still could be okay, but it still seems like there's a more probability than I like that maybe it will be significantly underfunded, and that's already something we've accepted. And I'm just not sure there's a good answer to that because
We have a good answer.
Do
It's
you?
gonna make you feel better. So, but if we could table this for about 90 seconds longer.
Okay, good.
We'll be.
I didn't know when was the right time to throw it out.
It's perfect. Don't worry.
Yeah.
But we're building, and James can make a slight, you know, deviation from the plan to give you the probability of this portfolio given Frank's assumptions, or Makita's assumptions, I should say. What is the likelihood of being fully funded in 30 years?
Okay.
And it's gonna be a number that's gonna make you feel better.
Good. Thank you.
All right, James. Sorry.
No, I think it's a good point, and we can toggle straight there. I think, you know, the point is essentially highlighting the reason why we try not to overly focus or emphasize a single scenario, because yes, the way that, you know, it is common practice to look at these things is to say, take a set of capital market assumptions as derived from Makita in this case, apply that to your portfolio and say, what is the median outcome? And really all that's saying is what's the 50th percentile outcome for your portfolio using those capital market expectations. And all that's saying is that roughly 50% of the expectations lie below that line, 50% lie above that. That doesn't really tell you the full picture that we need to understand when we talk about risk of the plan. We need to understand what's the likelihood of falling below that. Is the variance around that high or is it low? This median baseline assumption here, if you just assume, you know, if you just take this set of assumptions and you say, okay, this is the midpoint of that outcome, it doesn't really tell you a lot about what you need to know. I think what you're getting at is we need to understand, and we need to refine, we need to set an asset allocation that sort of optimizes the total path. We know that this path isn't going to be the one that happens, but what is the likelihood of outcomes around that? So this is why we use more sophisticated tools in order to, you know, view what are the likely ranges of outcomes around that. So if we look at this path, we have the market value funded status over a period of time using these assumptions. This is 2017 pension reform legislation, assuming that's fully implemented. We have Makita's long-term capital market expectations, and then 2017 GRS baseline numbers. And let's overlay on this what for us would be a risk limit in terms of market value of what we couldn't fall, a level of losses that if happened would cause us to trip this risk limit here, would cause us to be derailed from a path of achieving full funding in 30 years. That's why you see this line approaches exactly right about full funding at the 30th year. It gets to 98%, because at this point you can't really take a big loss and still achieve that. But that's not really what we're concerned about. What we're concerned about primarily is, if this is our goal, we're concerned about having an outcome that actually trips this risk threshold and sets us off of this path. So if we were to look at the full range of outcomes using Makita capital market expectations, what we'd see here is the range of outcomes that are likely. This is just the median path. The range of scenarios that are possible are characterized here. So by order of confidence level. So the 90th confidence level here you can see is sort of a very bad outcome as we would assess it. And we can have roughly 90% confidence that in this case, over the next 5 years, we will not trip that level. And so if you look at that, if you extend that out to say, we're comfortable with having only 75% confidence that we achieve, that's really over the next 15 to 20 years. And then obviously on the upside here, you have significantly better outcomes. So if you were to look and translate sort of into this framework, the probability given these assumptions of achieving full funding inside of 30 years, that's really around 65 to 70% confidence. So this is sort of the output of one asset allocation. What we're trying to do here is assess different asset allocations and their viability for us. So what if, for example, we were to select a more aggressive or higher risk, higher return asset allocation? The way you'd see these paths sort of move is you'd have full funding, the possibility of achieving that earlier, and you'd have this line move up. But the other thing you'd have that's undesirable is these bands here would move out. These bands would move down as well. So if we were to pursue an asset allocation like that, what you might not be able to achieve a 90% confidence of not tripping this threshold in the next 5 years. That confidence might reduce to 80 or 75% in a scenario like that. On the flip side, if we wanted to consider pursuing a more conservative asset allocation, what the outcome would be is visualized here would be this median line here would decline and the expected time period to full funding would increase, but then also these bands would compress inward towards the median expectation as well. And so in those scenarios, we could say this is the only risk we care about. We could potentially define a scenario that, or an asset allocation that takes longer to achieve full funding, but these bands compress into towards the median. And so we might be able to have, say, a 95 or a 99% confidence level of not tripping this threshold. So this is sort of is for us an illustration of the problem and what we're trying to do when we think about asset allocation. But the innovation here that we're trying to bring to the fore is this idea of directly relating all of the things that we really care about that matter to our plan. For example, this risk limit.
I think it should be noted also that
we're showing a scenario that's different than what the General Assembly used to contemplate the level of contribution rates. They actually, Peggy, correct me if I'm wrong, they included in the scenario, I forget which scenario it was,
Scenario 5B.
5B. They anticipated a 5-year period of earning 4% at the front end to try to force a little bit of conservatism, into this, and contemplated a reduction in the
Assumed rate of return
to 7 after 2022.
2021 is when we'll do the next experience study. That's when we'll make the recommendation for a rate of return.
So, we're showing something that's slightly, really looking at the whole plan through our lens, not expecting exactly the same things that were the foundation for. But the good news is they chose to be more conservative and set funding in a more conservative way, which is why you can get to your goal even if your portfolio does not earn 7.25 over time. Right? So there's a if you want to think of that like Warren Buffett, there's a margin of safety there that they've built into this that is just better plan design.
And the General Assembly's plan achieve full funding at 20 years?
I am not going to answer a question on behalf of the General Assembly. But we'll defer to anyone else comfortable enough to do that.
Well, Peggy, it's correct me if I'm wrong, but it's designed to meet the requirements of the statute, right? Ultimately, where we walk down the funding, where we walk down the unfunded liability period down to, like, there's a requirement that we walk it down every year to 20, right? And then it can't, once we start moving from there, it can't get any worse than it was the year before. It's the way that I understand how it is implemented. So it's designed to do that, the funding protocol.
The Joint Pension Committee specifically said that they wanted a greater level of confidence that the system was going to make progress towards full funding, and that short-term market volatility would not have as dramatic of an impact. So they forced higher contribution rates into the statutory limits. They went through much of the same discussion that James is, talking about the commission going through and looking at different scenarios to determine how much risk there was that we would not achieve a 7.25% rate of return, and expecting that we would get more conservative as time goes on. So they wanted to know, even if long-term expectations were lower and short-term performance was significantly lower than what was expected, would they still have a higher degree of comfort that they would meet the statutory framework of getting to a 20-year amortization period within the next 10 years. So each year when we give them the annual valuations, we also give them an update on where we are with regard to scenario 5B, because the annual valuations have to be based on the assumptions that are adopted by either our board or are dictated in statute. So we have to use that 7.25% rate of return, and we have to use actual liabilities and actual investment performance. But that valuation is just a snapshot in time. Last year, June 30, 2017, that amortization period was at 24 years. So it had dropped dramatically from the 30 years, but, if you force in that short-term investment underperformance that the committee took into consideration, it could stagnate there for several years before it makes any further progress. Actual investment experience will be what drives where that amortization period is in any given year.
I think that, James, I apologize if you hit this, but the gray dotted line, you can see sort of halfway through, is basically when the plan achieves, is it 80%? Funded status? Is that
85.
85. You see that the risk limit move up toward the median line, and that's what is contemplated is that would be the moment that they could start giving relief in the contribution rates. So the contribution rates could scale down, but for your kind of asset allocation thinking, that's less money coming into the plan. That has the opposite effect of what we talked about earlier, and now you need to manage more of your liquidity risk, kind of shortens your time horizon a little bit and makes you a little more sensitive to short-term factors. So you need to contemplate how your asset allocation is going to exist through that. So, but that's 2033. So.
How does this work as we progress along the trajectory? So when we move to 2020, then do we become, our risk target is 100% funded in 29 years, and then at 2021 it's 100% funded in 28 years. So do we keep moving and reducing our risk target to 100% funded in a lower amount as we move each year along, or is it constantly at 30 years?
No, so the way I frame this up is assuming that we want to actually progress through the amortization, as Perry referenced, the unfunded liability amortization period. As the board established, so that funding period actually only sort of becomes what they call a closed AM period until you reach that 20-year window, so 30 to 29 to 28, et cetera. This is why I mentioned before that primarily here we're looking at the early periods. I don't think anybody would be too disappointed if we achieve 98% funded instead of 100% funded at some point in 30 years. That's not really what this is about. But yeah, the way I've presented this is at every point for the next 30 years, let's maintain that static target to achieve that. So it doesn't necessarily mean, to your point about the funding period, that actually doesn't statutorily decrease beyond 20 years. once we achieve that. But yeah.
So just as an example, as say 10 years out, say we followed that dark red line, and at 2028, we're pretty much where we are right now, still a little over 50% funded. What would this model be telling us to do at that point in time if we are on that dark red line at 10 years out from now?
Yeah, so we would be at that point, likely reforecasting this model and looking at, an entirely new set of assumptions. Now, at that point, say we were beyond the 20-year window, say we were at this point a 15-year, for example, effective sort of funding period, we wouldn't necessarily, sort of tripping that line wouldn't be anything that would necessarily, even if this were actuarial value instead of market value, wouldn't necessarily be tripping a funding or a contribution rate increase per se, but it would be something that, we would consider at that point. But I think the considerations at that point, it's hard to say the differences that they would, that there would be. We would be, forecasting this entire, reforecasting this entire framework. It may not be a goal at that time to say we're going to be fully funded in 15 years. That might not be an achievable outcome, given capital market expectations. But again, this is why I think for us, it's, the focus is on making this as flexible a framework as we can. And there's, I would caution against too, just sort of thinking through weaknesses in the stochastic process in general against focusing on too far out of projections using a stochastic process. This is, certainly a little bit better at thinking about things over, sort of a 5 to 10 year framework. 30 years, when you incorporate any reasonable level of volatility, you can have outcomes that, I don't want to get into too much math, but these are assumed to be independent events essentially these years. So you can get into outcomes that become increasingly wide in terms of their dispersion if you look too far out. So we'd caution against focusing on too far out in this model.
There's what do we do with the portfolio? But I think there's also part of it also is how do you communicate with the other key stakeholders in the system? And I think the important thing is, a constant dialogue on how you view, and of course this falls to Mike and I, how do we view probabilities? And, by having constant interaction, you say, yeah, we think, sitting here today, we think 65% as an example, probability we're not, we're going to be fully funded. There's also, call it a 70% probability that we get down to some uncomfortable level. I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that those probabilities are understood. So this is not a riskless system for the state. I mean, very clearly at this point.
So this is to help explain to other people how risky the system is, or how risky it can be.
There are applications for us in asset allocation.
So what are so I guess if we don't have applications for like 10 years out, what would be the applications for today? How does this help us inform us?
Sure. Well, James, can you go back to the questions?
Yeah. I think, if I get to,
there you go.
To answer.
Well, no,
Yeah, I think what.
I guess I was looking for a sort of an example as opposed to sort of a hypothetical.
Ultimately what the commission needs, when we talk, with Funson about strategic decision-making, I think this is a area where the commission can significantly weigh in on strategic decision-making, because at the end of the day, the commission needs to really weigh in and decide if we're going to utilize this framework, what matters, right? Because, James, go forward a couple slides. There's a list of risks there that we would try to avoid. Those are, what we think, right? Those are just risks that we've kind of come up with in order to, to be able to produce these examples. And then we've assigned those a confidence interval and a forward period that we're trying to avoid. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's ultimately what the commission needs. The commission needs to weigh in ultimately and decide which risks are important. What confidence interval do you want to set when you're thinking about asset allocation so that you're above those risks. And what forward period are you trying to avoid, right? In order to, to assess those risks. And then once you've kind of made those decisions, the input to that framework is whatever asset allocation you want it to be. It can be ours, it can be a peer's, it can be something along the spectrum of between us and a peer. But it gives you the ability to determine whether or not, the thing that I like about this framework, and I certainly don't want us to fall in love with our own idea, but what I like about this framework is it gives us an objective yardstick to judge strategic decision making by, so that and it gives us a degree of confidence that what we've selected works for us, given the risks that we're trying to avoid, with the ultimate goal of we're trying to get to fully funded status, right? That's ultimately what we're trying to do. And but we know that it's not as you say, it's not a riskless system, right? But so how do we set a confidence interval around risks that we're trying to avoid, and then we plug asset allocations into that to make sure that we stay above those risk limits.
More simply, I think when we see something in that kind of path of outcomes that is uncomfortable, I think it causes us to say, okay, what portfolio change
Like, give me
can
an
we
example.
make?
Tell me.
So James, can you, okay, so let's say that where that gray line intersects, let's say we adopt, we don't want to even have a 10% probability of asking for more money. Okay, well then we have a wrong portfolio, right? So that sends us to the drawing board. Do we have too much equity? Do we have too much emerging market debt? What are the changes to the portfolio that you could undertake to give yourself a better probability of not breaching that threshold? So it would be an exploration in asset allocation of what are the ways that we can, try to not sacrifice the slope of that black line, and it may not move the dark red line, but really to try to remove that essentially tail risk to the downside. But we can turn this to be useful in a number of ways. The challenge that James highlighted is the temptation is to just kind of look at where does this take us, but that works if the only time you're going to look at it is today, right?
Yeah, I think that's my concern, is that I think as we move forward along it, I don't know that I would like to be on that black line, but I don't know that we necessarily will be on that black line.
Sure.
And I'm having difficulty seeing how we continue to use this model without reforecasting it.
Oh, I think you're
resetting our 30-year, well, if we look at being funded another 30 years, as we've been doing for so long.
Yep.
So I think that's my concern. Is that
The risk concern. And the risk limit doesn't. I mean, the risk limit could be avoid the black hole effect, right? That could, if you want to frame that as a risk limit, right? Or the risk limit could be, let's avoid having to have a confidence interval that keeps us above having to ask for additional contributions, right? And your capital market expectations are going to change through time. But as you continue to plot this out, they can also serve as this can serve as kind of the canary in the coal mine to a certain extent, because as capital market expectations change, as market conditions change, and you plug those variables into this kind of forward-looking and framework into the risk that you're attempting to avoid, do you need to make any substantive change in order to avoid those risks as time goes on, right? I mean, it doesn't, this doesn't need to be the only risk that we consider. It can be ultimately can be whatever risk that the commission ultimately finds to be the most important.
Yeah, I mean, some of what you're talking about, and I mean, we've talked about this a lot, and I talked about it with Jeff this morning, right, is banks and other types of entities that are doing asset liability not matching in the sense if I got enough assets to offset my liability, but matching in terms of character, right? So banks have pools of floating rate versus fixed rate based on is their funding fixed or floating, right? So, I mean, it's not per se. I think one of the things that gets lost when we say asset liability management, people say, well, we're in a deficit, we don't have enough assets to do that. as opposed to I need the character of my assets and liability, and I need the shape of my assets and liability to align or to understand where I want to be mismatched, right? I mean, banks by design borrow short and lend long. They know they have that mismatch, right? And so then it's becomes questions of degrees and how do you manage it. So I think one of the things that'd be important to add, so, I mean, long story short, you're asking, should you do this? Yes, I think the more robust that, is, because I think a lot of stuff gets rolled up and then it doesn't become particularly useful from a management standpoint. But I think knowing not just the degree of difference between assets and liabilities, but also the shape, right, the timing, right, those things. For example, that liability stream, if all of them are 19 years plus, is a much different animal than, really some of them are 7-year liabilities, right, and I got some sort of weird hump. And I just say that, like, normally pension plans kind of have a very smooth assumption, but we have a very weird demographic thing in this country, right? Just employment, we have a whole bunch of millennials, we got a whole bunch of baby boomers, and we don't have a lot of mid-career people. And I think that actually is some of what we see in the plan. I mean, this is part of what we're housing, right? I think it's some of what's made its misses probably on employment growth, right, and payrolls. I mean, there's some weird demographic shapes, cohorts, if you will, in the population that I think it'd be worth kind of understanding and tracking and projecting. What does that actually look like, out here? Because then you can match, again, not match in terms of dollars, but match in terms of character, assets and liabilities, which will truncate some of this behavior, right? I think, and make you feel better, about it.
Yeah.
And the General Assembly embedded some provisions to basically prevent you from being on that red line for an extended period of time, because the statutes require that we move from 30 years to 20 years over the next 10 years.
Right.
And if performance is lower than what they took into consideration in that very conservative projection, then the statutes require contributions to be increased to keep it on that path. So not that I'm saying employers could afford higher contributions. That would be another policy question to be raised at the time. But right now, the statutes do provide that cover, if you will, so that you don't continue along that red line.
Yeah, and ultimately, and you can set that, and with the way that this works, we can set that as a risk, right, of tripping additional contributions, and then we can see what is the probability based on our asset allocation. If we think that's one of the limits that we want to avoid, we can set that, and that can be the gray line, right? And then you can. So it's the one thing that I don't want the commission to get necessarily hung up on is this is just one of many risks that the commission can consider, and ultimately there's a menu of risks. We just have to pick which ones that we think best inform our asset allocation choices, and this is so, like we say, if we wanted that gray dotted line to be when do you trip contribution increases, we can make that the gray line, and we would know. We'd have a sense of what probability are we above avoiding, what forward period are we above avoiding that line. If that is a risk, which I say is certainly an important risk, because I think we're asking, as Peggy, I think we're asking about as much out of employers as we can ask out of them. And that's something that we can factor in, because at the end of the day, like I said, the point of this whole exercise is trying to figure out, when we take into consideration all of the facets of our plan and the risks that we're trying to avoid, at the end of the day, we're being, the drive is to get, the goal is to get fully funded. How do we incorporate all that to pick the best asset allocation that works for us at the end of the day? And that's going to perform, quite frankly, relative to others as it does. But that doesn't, it could be that it performs poorly against the peers, but that doesn't necessarily, or it could be that it performs well against the peers. But because my concern is, if you have an asset allocation where you perform poorly against the peers, it can create a sense that you need to increase risk so that you can kind of get over this median pension fund return. And likewise, if you're performing above the peers, they didn't give you the sense that you're taking the right risks, right? Or you're taking the right amount of risk, which could be, you could be wrong in both directions. But you can overlay those asset allocations into this framework, and as long as you're determining the risks you're trying to avoid, and that gives you a sense of whether or not you're doing the right thing for the plan, for our plan. And that's, I think that's where that's where to me is kind of the driving force is let's figure out what's right for us at the end of it.
Yeah, I'd say that the other aspect, right, which we see a little bit with our risk parity guys, right? They're taking low risk assets and leveraging them up to make them more equity-like. You can also go the other way, right? I mean, there are things, we have equities, you can take them and do strategies that make them look more bond-like and meet in the middle as well, right? With cash today becomes more valuable than cash tomorrow to you, right? That same math can be used to truncate off, right? I mean, we don't need the 20% return. We don't need the 15. We need 7 or 8, like predictable, right? So I can sell off, 15 through 25% returns, right? Which help me truncate that, So, I mean, there are things like that you can do as well.
Our utility function is different than if that's us. Than the plan that starts at 75% funded, right? I mean, you just have a different set of circumstances. So we just need to, the way I've described it internally is to kind of define what is our utility function and define those outcomes that really are kind of the edge of the field for us that we really don't want to reach. And then, see what that does to our preference for different asset allocations. I don't think this is something that needs to overpower the work, but I think this as a third rail to the work already being done really makes it much more meaningful, and anticipate an opportunity to anticipate not just how great it works, but what does it not working, what are the knock-on effects of that? How do we spend some time focusing more on that? So.
Yeah, so I think that point, it's, it sort of dovetails into where we're going with this, which is talking about, taking it from a single asset allocation projection into looking at the different asset allocation choices that we actually have in characterizing those. You can't look at all of the choices that we have in this framework very neatly. So if you were to move to that and we were to take not only sort of where our portfolio is, but what all of our goals are that we would consider in terms of asset allocation, we can actually put those, translate those into that framework too in terms of risk and return. So if you think, and yes, this is a chart with just a single blue dot in the page, but it'll get a little bit more complicated in a second. Yeah. So this is Makita capital market expectations applied to our portfolio in terms of risk and return. But let's go ahead and apply sort of what we would consider in terms of our portfolio or our plan goals rather in terms of this. So let's start with our assumed rate of return. What does that look like if we translate this into the average return space, spreading volatility against return, and we can see where we're at, where our expected outcome is in relation to our assumed rate of return. Let's overlay another goal in here, the goal that we talked about with respect to that risk limit, achieving 100% funded inside of 30 years. If we translate that into risk return space, what does that look like? What this essentially is telling us is that portfolios to the right of this line are portfolios that do not have a 90% confidence level of not tripping that risk limit over the next 5 years. So obviously the goal here is to move as far as you can up and to the left, higher return, less risk, right? But we're of course constrained by the number of achievable asset allocations for us. So if we were to characterize that risk, let's say that's the only risk we care about, what we'd be incentivized to do is, as much as possible, move in a perpendicular direction to that line, if that's the only risk that we care about. And we can define any risk that we that we care about in this framework. Let's layer on, though, another risk that we talked about a little bit earlier. Let's think about if our goal is to, say, beat the median peer group. If we look at our peer group and our 36 peers that make up the BNY public plan universe above 5 billion, who are those peers based on Makita's long-term capital market expectations? Where do their risk return expectations line up in relation to us, in relation to our risk goals? If this is our risk objective here, then obviously plans to the right of this, these are not asset allocations that we would consider. Certainly there's a good number of plans that are also below our assumed rate. This is our current asset allocation too, just to be clear where we were at based on if you take our 2015 asset allocation, we would have been a dot right about here. So this is the directional move we've made over the past 3 years with respect to our asset allocation, just in terms of where we're at. So we're not really making any conclusions from this slide, but we want to give you all of this information. And I think with respect to the asset allocation discussions that happen, we think this is, we want to know this. We want to have all of this information and sort of consider it in terms of our considerations there. So obviously asset allocation is certainly a decision that dwarfs most of the other incremental investment decisions we make here. So this is sort of defines our path.
Are there any risk profiles that we fall outside of?
No, so we could let's say this, if we took this to say 99% confidence, then we would simply, then this line would sort of migrate over here, and we would currently be outside of, say, hypothetically a 99% confidence level for this same risk limit. So yeah, and I think this Chairman Gillespie, I think this addresses the sort of part of the question that you asked about earlier about the dispersion of outcomes and peer returns. This is a pretty wide, if you look at the x-axis, 700 basis points of spread across expected volatility for these plans. You have a plan here at almost 17% expected volatility, and you have a plan here at just over 10. So these are radically different asset allocations. Won't get into the details in open session, but the asset allocations here look wildly different. This is a it's a tough problem to think about.
So if we were outside the risk limit, then we would set our allocation so we could move inside the risk limit?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it seems like.
Principle.
Yeah, the principle is, it gives
Which,
you,
I mean, it seems like we would, even without knowing where a risk limit was, we would always want to move to the left and up. And if we couldn't do, and if we could do that already, we would have. I'm just not seeing how this actually helps. It makes us feel good that we're outside the risk limit right now, or inside the risk limit right now, but I don't know, does it really help us identify a better asset allocation that moves us northwest?
well, if this is, the risk limit that the commission one of the risk limits that the commission wants to consider, then, what you can do is, you think your goal is to move northwest, then you explore how do you get there along the way, right? I mean, so it gives you, like, if you want to move further northwest, then you say, okay, let's look at
But we would always want to move further
Right.
northwest.
But I'm saying, like, yeah.
I mean, there's no instance in which we don't want to do that.
But what I'm saying is, like, if you wanted to do that today, right?
Okay. Yes, I do.
Right, you want to do that today. And we can go look at that.
We're picking up on that.
There's no cost to do so.
Right. But, we can go, for instance, figure out who the green dot right there is, that's northwest, right?
Yes, let's find out who they are. Right.
What are they doing and can we do it?
Yes.
Right, that's what it gives you the ability to do, is that,
Okay.
yeah, so that's the action, that's the output. The input is, or any, quite frankly, any allocation kind of along the way, right? Or even past that. Is there a way to push that efficiency past that where, you know, and that's the, you know, that's the, you know, the beauty of, I think, of, you know, this kind of this framework. But, you know, but I think the commission's ultimately got to make the decision, what risk are we trying to avoid, right? That's the ask, I think, of, and the strategic piece of this is, what's the commission ultimately, if the commission likes this, what are we trying to avoid? Because and what confidence interval are we trying to be above in order to, you know, and how does that then inform where we are, and do we need to contemplate changes to our asset allocation? Right?
Even where there's not a green dot, there's a portfolio that corresponds to any place on that chart. You move far enough away, and you get to the point where, you know, when we were kind of using mean variance optimization to come up with the most efficient portfolio was 85% infrastructure, right, which we can't do. You know, so you hit some logical constraints along the way, but you know, the logical question here is who's left and who's north, and you know, you avail yourself of that understanding. But you know, I hear your point, which is this should be the always on. How do we find our way northwest? And you know, I think that you're going to find some portfolios, whether you're moving northwest or any direction, there'll be considerable cost associated with you know, moving around.
Well, yeah, because I mean, there's two questions: what are they doing, and can we do it? Right? I mean, is it feasible for us to do,
or is it logical for us?
Or is it logical? Right? You know, it would be great if you could be, you know, move us completely west, but that's just not possible, right? You know, so it's how do you, and you don't necessarily, you might want to put more than one risk limit on this and see which one becomes most important. Right, of trying to avoid.
This might also help inform us of which risks we're incapable of avoiding.
Correct, right, yeah, because at the end of the day, it's not, there is no 100%, whatever risk limit you set, you're not gonna be able to develop a portfolio that's gonna be 100% above, right?
The other thing that I just feel is incumbent to point out is if there was a portfolio that Frank and company told us was a 9% portfolio with 11% vol, you would, on this page, you would intuitively say, what is that? And how do I get it?
Yeah.
The problem is that portfolio would have more peer risk than any other portfolio on this page. So what is our appetite to make the logical choice if it takes us outside of kind of the safety of the herd and could expose us to a continued multi-year period of looking poor against a peer group. I mean, you know, so there's this tension with these goals, and I guess the challenge is how do we establish what matters most and very clearly put that in our priorities.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, to me, the natural migration is let's use the information that we can glean from what others are doing as intelligence, and then we decide whether or not it works for us. But you know, there's no real way without a framework like this to decide whether or not it works for us. We know that it'll earn more return, but does that mean but does it avoid these risk limits, right? Yeah. So that's I think that's the usefulness of this, or one of the things that are useful.
Other questions? James is getting weary up there.
And these types of discussions would be good to continue at the next meeting with the extra time at the next meeting as we wear our strategic hat a little better.
Well, you know, Mr. Chairman, what I would propose is that we spend, you know, maybe some time at the next meeting really kind of defining what we think are the risks that are important, that the commission spend time defining what the risks are important, and then what, you know, the kind of the risk, confidence, and forward period. What are we ultimately? How do we define that framework? How do we define that risk framework? And then that'll help us, be able to produce, some, better, presentation on where we fall in that regard.
Well, thanks very much, James and Jeff and staff.
Mr. Chairman, from there, we were planning on turning it over to Nikita to do a 2017-2018 review in light of the fact that we have gone long. How do you think about the amount of time we should devote? Because we have that followed by the non-US investing question, followed by the foreign currency question, and I just want to make sure that we're optimizing the time here. So.
Yes, I would say that, from my point of view, the investment performance review is something we can read.
Okay.
And ask questions about if there are any. So I would maybe try to get the consensus of the commissioners that the non-US and the currency hedging are more important use of our time at this point. Comments about that?
All right, look at that. We just freed up some time. So Frank, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and I guess I'll also ask a logistical question. I don't want to necessarily stand between the commission and their lunch, so I don't know what the time frame was for that. Or if you want to, maybe break halfway, between, say, the non-US investing piece and the currency hedging piece. Does that make sense?
I know lunch is here now.
12:30.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm hungry.
I think Mr. Hancock expressed a desire to take a break now.
Call that an internal decision.
What should we do, commissioners?
I think let's just break for 5, go to the restroom, grab a food, and keep on working through it. Can we live with that?
Okay, sounds good for a break. Frank, thank you very much for putting up with this, with our current planning, but it's your time now. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have two things we're going to go through today. The first one I think is fairly straightforward and probably not too many questions, but it's more of a reminder about why you invest in assets that are outside the U.S. and take on some currency risk in doing so. And the second piece is related to the first piece, and that is, okay, if you're investing outside the U.S., and you're taking on currency risk, should you consider hedging some, all, or none of that currency exposure? So I'm going to start in your book, and here it's labeled page 2. And this is part of the reason why we're having a discussion. For the current year to date, and really most of the last 9 to 10 years, U.S. stocks have done better than non-U.S. stocks. It's just been a sort of golden age for U.S. equities. And it's part of the reason why people are asking, well, gee, why should we be investing outside the U.S.? And just looking at this year, so this is showing performance of the S&P 500, which is U.S. equities, MSCI EAFE, so that's Europe and Japan primarily, and MSCI emerging markets. The light blue line for each one is their total return year to date. This is through the end of September. And what you can see is U.S. stocks were up 11%. EAFE was up essentially flat, up 0.5%, and emerging markets were actually down. This question is why? I mean, is it because U.S. companies are doing that much better? Is it because of a currency effect? And so that's what we're showing you here. So if you look just at the U.S., you'll see two pieces here. You see a gray line, that's a dividend yield. Okay, very small. The yellow bar is showing you either expansion or contraction in the price earnings multiple. So if it's positive, it's expansion in the PE multiple, which is to say people are willing to pay more for earnings than they were at the beginning of the year. If it's negative, it says people are willing to pay less for earnings than they were at the beginning of the year. So you see it's slightly negative for US equities. Then that other blue line is the actual earnings growth, so growth in earnings per share year to date. And you can see that's the biggest driver in returns for US equities, 13% earnings growth, the dividend yield and PE contraction kind of offsetting each other. So have US equities done that much better in earnings growth than, say, non-US equities? And the short answer is no. What you see is 8% earnings growth year to date outside the US. So not quite as much as the US, but still very solid earnings growth, 8%. And what you see, however, those yellow bars are very negative. So that PE contraction of over 10% for EFI and over 17% for emerging markets. What this tells you is that investors are willing to pay less for earnings than they were at the beginning of the year, earnings of these companies in Europe, Japan, emerging markets, et cetera. And this is really more what we call sentiment. The idea that people are willing to pay less because they're worried probably about future earnings. They're worried about things such as what impact a trade war may have or terrorists may have on earnings in those countries. You do also see a bit of a currency impact there. So that little orange bar is showing you that currency has been a headwind in EFI down, it's been a drag about 1.7% of returns year to date. And for emerging markets, a much greater headwind this year, down 5.5%. So you've got good earnings growth, but currency working against you and people just willing to pay less for earnings year to date. The bottom bullet of this page, by the way, shows you if there had not been any currency effect and if there had been no change in that PE multiple, you would have expected about 14% return for US equities, 12% for EFI, and 15% for EM. That's showing you how dramatic the impact of PE contraction and currency has been year to date. Okay, so it's been painful year to date and painful really for longer than that. So let's step back for a minute. Why are you investing outside the US? Well, first thing is, the US makes up just over half of the investable universe. So nearly half the investable universe is outside the US. It is in those developed markets and in emerging markets. And how much fluctuates, obviously, as stocks go up and down, their market capitalization goes up and down. But this is using sort of a broad measure of equity. So if you were only investing in the US, you'd be missing out on roughly half the world, half of what's possible. We decided to boil it down to 3 reasons as to why you should invest in outside the US. First one, diversification benefits. And we're going to give you supporting slides for each of these. Second one, growth opportunities. There are a lot of opportunities outside the US. And third, valuations. You saw in that last slide just valuation contraction. This year, it's not the only year that's happened. And you'll see that stocks are much cheaper outside the US. So diversification benefits. You've probably seen something like this before. We call it the periodic table, except not the one you learned in chemistry class, the periodic table of investment returns. And what it's showing you is for each asset class, it keeps their same color each year, and then we rank the return for that year. So, for example, that bright red is emerging markets. You can see, and this is going back about 15 years, for much of the first half of this period, emerging markets were essentially the top performing asset class almost every year. And then you see a couple years where it was at the bottom, right? 2008, not surprising, 2011, and then a few years where it's been near the bottom. We'll call that the eggplant color is EFI. That's at Europe and Japan. You can see at the very end here, 2017, right below emerging markets, you can see the EFI kind of moves around quite a bit too. Doesn't ever hit that top. Emerging markets often hits that spot. It doesn't always hit the bottom either. But it does move around a lot. And then the blue, again right below EFI in the 2017 column, is US equities. And again, moves around a lot. It hits the top in one spot. It doesn't hit the bottom. obviously, you know, differences in returns. From year to year, you get different returns from each. Moreover, these returns tend to be cyclical. So what we've seen are long periods of relative outperformance and underperformance for U.S. equities versus non-U.S. equities. So in this chart, we're showing you rolling 3-year returns. The blue line is for U.S. equities, and the maroon line is for emerging markets. You can see very long periods of cyclical outperformance and underperformance. So early 90s, emerging markets did much better. Late 90s, U.S. did better. Early 2000s, you know, emerging up through, you know, about 2012, emerging markets much better. And pretty much since 2011 forward, it has been a great period for U.S. equities. The reason we point this out is, you know, if you think about the last 10 years has been so good for U.S. equities, we're not going to call a top or bottom, but clearly this has been cyclical in nature. We would expect that there will be some sort of reversion in that relationship. At some point, you're going to see U.S. equities lagging, and that's when you're going to be happy to have had that diversification in your portfolio. So number 2, growth. This is a chart showing, you know, we showed you at the beginning of the pie chart, you know, how much emerging markets currently comprise, how much non-US equities comprise of the total market capitalization. It's just showing how that has grown historically and perhaps more importantly, where it's projected to go. And this is a projection by Goldman Sachs. They're projecting that by 2030, emerging markets are going to comprise roughly 30% of total market capitalization. And interestingly, and you can see this in that maroon piece, the EFI portion, that Europe and Japan, has been continually shrinking. They're projecting it will continue to shrink to the point where it's going to be less than emerging markets around 2030. Perhaps more importantly, from your perspective, we just got off this discussion of the assumed rate of return and asset allocation. There are only so many asset classes, according to our projections, that are expected to get you a 7.25% return. Just so happens that developed market equities, EFI, is one of them, and that emerging market equity is actually our highest expected return asset class over the next 20 years. To make the point that we're not alone in that assumption, this is that survey I believe we showed you before. It was referenced in the last presentation. Horizon Actuarial Services does a survey every year of capital markets expectations by different consulting firms. And it turns out emerging market equities, you know, that green oval there, has the highest expected return across the average of all of the consulting firms. And in fact, you know, U.S. equities 7.4, non-U.S. developed 7.7. So again, these are the asset classes essentially you need in your portfolio if you want to get a 7.25% return. Third is valuations, and maybe this gets back to the cyclicality of it. What you're seeing on this page is the cyclically adjusted PE ratio for the S&P 500. So what does that mean? 2 things. Number 1, it's looking at earnings over the last 10 years, so smoothing out the earnings. And it's also inflation adjusted the earnings. That doesn't matter so much over the last 10 years. It matters when you talk about periods like, you know, the 1970s or 1940s. But it smooths out over these cycles and says, okay, what do prices look like? And what you can see is at the very end there, I can't remember if there's a little dot here or not. There it is. We're at around 31, 32 cyclically adjusted PE ratio, which is, you know, here's the average. Here's sort of one standard deviation above the average. We're well above the average historically. Does that mean we're due for a correction? Well, not necessarily. I mean, you can look, you know, here's the 1990s. We were, you know, it was well above, and here's that point in the 90s, and it kept going up, 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 up during the dot-com bubble. You know, it can stay, and it has been well above the average for most of the last 20 or 30 years. So we're not necessarily due to go all the way back down to here, but, you know,
we are looking at expensive stocks in the US, and historically speaking, when stocks have been expensive, their forward return, looking not 1 year out, but 10 years out, has been below average. Compare and contrast that with EFI and with emerging markets. EFI, we're seeing stock prices below their historical average, in the 20, well below what we just saw for the US. And for emerging markets, again, below their average and less than half what you're seeing for the US. So in other words, emerging markets, developed markets, are much cheaper right now than US markets. And in fact, they're cheaper than their historical average. There might be very good reasons for this. Maybe there are concerns about future economic growth, future earnings growth, a number of things that make good arguments for why this is the case. But certainly, what we have seen historically is that lower valuations have led to higher expected returns, have led to higher actual returns over longer horizons. Again, if you're looking out 7, 10, 20 years, but not necessarily looking out over 1 year. So this isn't a tactical measure, it's more of a strategic measure. We also wanted to compare you to peers, say, do you look that much different from your peers? No, you don't. When we looked at your portfolio and combine not just your equities, but everything else you have that's likely invested outside the US, you look like you're about 26% non-US dollar. Our peers, and again, to Jeff's point from a couple hours ago, there is no such thing as the median peer plan, but if you take the median or the average of that peer group, we estimate about 25% is non-US dollars. So you look very similar to your peers in that regard. So our conclusions, you're not that much different from your peers. You're taking on very similar non-US dollar risk. There are 3 very good reasons to continue to invest outside the US. The diversification benefits, the growth potential, and much lower valuations. And I think it's just very straightforward, but we're re-emphasizing points. You continue to invest outside the US and to have that diversification in your portfolio. Any questions before I move on to discussion of currency hedging?
Just when the whole discussion of emerging markets, and you've shown us the historical pattern, which obviously takes quite a bit of time. I guess the question arises: is it different this time? And I don't know what the answer to that is, except I think that you have to look at things as they are now, perhaps not so much as they have been, but where we're going to go.
More forward-looking, absolutely.
It just seems to me that given the fact that the U.S. economy and interest rates have been where they are, and we now are in the period of so-called normalization of rates, the effect of that on emerging markets obviously would be more negative than positive, number one. But number two, from what I've read, emerging markets are in much better shape now in terms of debt and so forth than they were 10 years ago. So, I mean, you try to balance all this out. I do believe that there is, in some ways, more geopolitical risk than there is economic risk going forward. And that's very difficult to judge. So, having said all that, do we just go back to saying that they're cheap relative to where they've been historically, and therefore, going forward for the next 20 years, we should continue to be invested in emerging markets? I mean, 70% of the world's population, or 73% is in emerging markets. We have these huge emerging middle classes. On the other hand, China's a great example of a country with great population, an emerging middle class, and a 6.5% growth rate, which we would kill for. On the other hand, they're saying that's negative and slowing because they're going off of 10%. So balancing all that out, do we still continue to stay the course in emerging markets?
So when we build our models, and presumably when all the other firms in that survey build their models, they're not building it based on this. They're not just saying, oh, well, from 2003 to 2007, they produced 30% average returns, and we're going to assume that's going to happen again. That would be nice to see that again, certainly, but we're not assuming that. What we're assuming is a couple of things, and maybe I'll go back to here, sort of the building blocks approach. The dividend yield's your starting point. If there's any currency impact in it, and I'm gonna get to this in a few minutes, that we're gonna assume over the long run, currency kind of washes out. Although, to your point, you have much higher US interest rates and overseas interest rates, you're getting this strong dollar, which is impacting growth in those economies. So then it gets down to the PE multiple and the PE multiple, we assume sort of mean reversion to a point. And it's partly why we assume, lower, 7% returns for US equities as opposed to, say, 8.5% returns for emerging markets. One of the things that's really propped up earnings growth here in the US, and I'm getting into the weeds here, is this is not earnings growth, this is earnings per share growth. Now, if you've paid attention over the last 9 years, we've had record amounts of share buybacks in the US. Instead of issuing dividends, companies have used their cash to buy back their shares. It's what we call the denominator effect. If earnings is growing slowly, but you're reducing the denominator, earnings per share is inflated. So that's why you're seeing very significant earnings per share growth. Contrast that outside US, someplace like China. China, their market's growing so much, they have significant share issuance, not buybacks. So it's actually, diminished their earnings per share. So it's been a negative in terms of looking at it from this standpoint, and it may continue to be a drag going forward. It's something we build into our models. We try to bring that into account. We can't project exactly how much that's going to be, but we try to account for that. So yes, we're doing this on a very much a forward-looking basis. We're not expecting, again, some of these numbers are just obscene here. 78% return for emerging markets in 2009. We're not expecting that, but we are expecting going forward from emerging markets to continue to do well.
Is this the whole discussion about emerging markets and EFI related only to public markets? Or does it include, and the same thing, carry over to private market investments in those areas?
It does to some extent. Some of your private equity, some of your real estate, when you're doing infrastructure, some of your hedge funds, your GAA managers, all of those are going to have non-US dollar exposure as well. So in that figure we calculate to 26%, we're trying to account for, it tells you in the footnote here what we did. We assumed that like half of your infrastructure GAA was non-US dollar. Some of your emerging market debt, there is additional non-US dollar exposure, but the two biggest components are in your equity piece, your public equity.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
In your projections, could you put the projection slide back on there? Yes. Is the approach there to project in a single step the market performance in these various markets?
Yes, this is a 20-year.
As opposed to, I guess what I'm saying is, are you projecting currency fluctuations and in-country performance separately, or are you blending them together in your projection approach?
So this is the survey of the group, which is why if you look on the right, you see all these green dots. That's all the different data points, if you average around 8.8. I can't speak for every other firm, how they do it. I can speak to ours. We do put currency into account there. We cap it because, and you're going to hear me say this in a few minutes, currency is notoriously difficult to project over a long-term time horizon. And we don't want that to be the driver of our expected returns, either for including it or excluding it from a portfolio. We do try and account for it based on different theoretical measures, but we cap it at 1% impact there.
You have long-term
conclusions as to U.S. versus developed non-US equity return. You know, it's the thing that sort of been the devil in our shoe for a number of years, but I don't know, on a longer term basis, if you feel that we should forecast more modest returns for non-US or there's a return to the mean over time between the two.
Yeah, so the one this time is different question I've been asking myself for the last 10 years is this PE ever going to revert back to here, to average, or even below it? And I'm not necessarily confident that it is. And so we don't necessarily build our models assuming that it is going to get back to that point. Skip past it. You know, our answer is, I mean, it's encapsulated here. You should continue to invest outside the U.S. You should, you know, we don't have dramatically different return expectations. We do still have higher return expectations for emerging markets. Much of, as you're going to see in the currency hedging piece, much of the drag over the last few years has been because of currency and not because of lower earnings. So no, we're not recommending any changes certainly today based on that. All right, so I'm going to jump into part 2, which is the discussion of currency hedging. This is going to be part education, part recommendation. So this we really already covered. This is looking at your portfolio versus peers. You know, your portfolio is about 26%, roughly speaking, non-US dollar, including things outside public equities. If you're investing in non-US dollar assets, you are, by default, taking on the risk of investing in that currency. And that is the risk that those currencies will fluctuate vis-a-vis the US dollar, both in the short term and the long term. To get a sense for the impact of that, on this page, we're showing the return. So in the reddish bar, that's what the return was in the home currency. And the blue bar is what you got being a US dollar investor. And you can see sometimes the changes are differences are very dramatic to your benefit, but sometimes, you know, it's to your detriment. So we're showing it, here's developed markets and here's emerging markets. So year to year, it can be pretty sizable changes. It can be different between even a positive or a negative return, but it tends not to be that dramatic. We're looking at maybe 3% per year on average.
Just a question, I don't know how to really evaluate it, but the fact that there's such a cost of currency hedging for non-US, particularly Europeans or whatever, to buy US debt, for instance, almost cancels out apparently at this point, cancels out the yield advantage. So I don't know, where does that factor in?
If I can get you to hold on a couple pages for me to talk about the cost, that'd be okay?
No.
Thank you. All right, so that was showing you impact for specific indices. This shows you more for specific currencies, how volatile they can be. So it's kind of a mismatch here, but if you look, the red dashed line, that's the volatility, you know, rolling 3-year volatility of the S&P 500. And then this is the the monthly returns of all of these currencies, different currencies versus the US dollar. And what you can see is a lot of them, you know, their volatility is similar to that of the equity market. So significant volatility that this introduces to your portfolio. The return you actually get, obviously very straightforward. You get return in a local currency plus the impact of the currency. It also impacts your volatility in the portfolio. And just like it does if you're doing the volatility math, you know, you get the risk of the asset, the risk of the currency, and then whatever correlation there is between the currency and the asset. All right, so starting to look at that currency impact. It can be positive or negative. So, you know, this is the return you might get. The return can boost your returns, can be negative. If you're going to hedge them, there is potentially a hedging cost. Now, the most common way to hedge are with derivatives, and you already use derivatives in your portfolio in other areas. Forwards, futures, you can even do options and swaps, especially if you're looking to do something longer term. but you tend to see forwards and futures are most commonly used for hedging currencies. So here's where maybe we can start talking about cost. Actually, no, I'll wait 2 more pages. Actually, I'm gonna skip this one too. So let's talk about the cost of hedging. In theory, the cost of hedging is the difference between the interest rate in the home country, US, so think of it as 90-day T-bills, and the interest rate in that foreign country, whatever the equivalent is in the UK, Eurozone, Japan, China, etc. Now, there are additional costs on top of that, but this is the main driver of that cost. What this chart is showing you is that historically, this bluish line is the cost for hedging emerging markets, and the reddish line is the cost of hedging EFI. So the cost for hedging emerging markets historically has always been positive, that is, it's always cost you money to do so, and for the most part, it's always been very large. So essentially, the bigger the difference in interest rates between the US and non-US, the larger that cost of hedging. So it makes sense if you're talking about countries that are having maybe greater inflation tend to have higher interest rates. So Brazil, for example, China, Russia, they tend to have higher interest rates than the US, hence, because if they're at 6% and we're at 2%, then you're gonna see, a cost of hedging of nearly 4%. In contrast, if think about most of Europe and Japan right now have low and in some cases even negative interest rates. You can get to the point which we are at right now technically, where you actually get paid to hedge. Believe it or not, you get paid to hedge your currency at certain points in time. Now, this is not a static thing. You can see, here we had 5 years we're getting paid to hedge and it reverses. It's a little bit cyclical. It depends on the movements of the US dollar versus those currencies. But you can, in theory, be getting paid to hedge. And we are in an environment right now where that is the case with developed markets. Think about how low, again, interest rates are, particularly in Europe, but also Japan. Next thing we'll mention is around volatility, and I do want to mention one operational risk here, and it's this concept of basis risk, so some investment jargon. The idea that when you hedge, your hedge may not be perfect. It may end up hedging 95% or 105% of what you meant to hedge because currencies are moving day to day. You're hedging using instruments that are probably resetting monthly, quarterly, maybe even longer term than that. And because there's that difference in time frame, difference in valuations over that time frame, there's going to be slight differences. So you won't have a perfect hedge. And that's known as basis risk. But it tends to be a fairly small amount of what you're actually getting. The other thing is if you look at volatility, how much it adds to each portfolio. So for EFI, we expect the volatility of the asset class, and this is historically, this is the last 20 years. We've had about 15% vol due to just the asset class, and then about another 2 to 3% due to currency volatility. Emerging markets, unsurprisingly, have been more volatile, and the currency impact has been even larger, perhaps unsurprising as well. And this, by the way, this is foreign bonds, and this tends to be primarily Europe and Japan again. You see the volatility of the asset class very low, very similar to US bonds, but when you take into currency impact is actually greater than the volatility of the asset class in local currency terms. And that matters because the chart on the right, this red line, this is showing you the correlation of the asset class with US bonds, with the currency effect. And then the blue line is if you hedge the currency, you can see the correlation is essentially 0.9 for most of the history. In other words, unsurprisingly, the non-US bond market behaves very much like the US bond market once you hedge out the currency impact. All right, so looking at historical correlations, while that was the case for bonds, it really hasn't been the case for equities. So the blue line and the red line here are the hedged and unhedged for EFI. You can see they behave very much like each other. And in fact, they sometimes reverse. And the same thing for emerging markets. So correlation doesn't change that much when you hedge out the currency on the equity side. It has a big impact on the bond side, not on the equity side. So what about history in terms of returns? Has it made sense historically to hedge? I mean, have you gotten paid to hedge historically? What impact has it had? The chart on the left is the growth of the dollar for mostly the last 20 years or so. The blue line being, and this is for IFI, so again, Europe and Japan. The red line, I'm sorry, should be if you invested as a US dollar investor. And the blue line is if you had hedged over that time period. And what you can see is that it kind of moves back and forth about which is more favorable. Now, as we stand today, you would have been slightly better off if you had hedged your IFI exposure. Now, it would have been a different story if we looked at this 4 years ago, or even if we had started the chart 4 years later. So there's definitely some endpoint and beginning point bias when looking at this. However, when you look at the emerging markets piece, you can see that you would have been decidedly better off leaving it unhedged. The unhedged has done much better, and with most of that happening really over the last 15 years. Prior to that, there wasn't much difference. Now, some of that may be differences because you're talking about China going off the dollar peg, for example, was one thing that happened a few years back. So the next question is, okay, if we're thinking about hedging, how much should we hedge? Do you hedge your entire exposure that you actually can? Do you not hedge anything? Do you take some intermediate approach? A half hedge is sometimes a popular approach. We kind of call that minimizing regret. It's better to be half right all the time than fully right, fully wrong half the time. There are a lot of different ways to do this. It really depends on what you're comfortable doing, and we're going to get to some concerns we have later that we'll get back to this point. Historically speaking, how much has it made sense to hedge? So what we created was, roughly speaking, a 60-40 portfolio, but a bit more nuanced than that and a bit more diversified. You can see if you want to read the footnote. And the idea is, okay, if you'd left that unhedged historically, and this is looking again about a 20-year horizon, you would have gotten about an 8% return with about 12% vol. If you'd fully hedged the IFI equities and the emerging market equity, and that's the key point here, you have actually had a lower return, but lower vol, unsurprisingly. If you had half hedged, well, guess what? You end up halfway in between. Again, unsurprising. 7.9% return, 11.7 in the vol. And then what if you'd only hedge the developed markets? So emerging markets, if we point out, historically it's been expensive to hedge. Today it's still current to hedge, still very expensive to hedge. You've actually enhanced your return while reducing the volatility from where you were. So historically, it would have made sense to hedge your developed market portfolio from a risk-return standpoint. So that's over the full period. What about during periods of crisis or market stress? So you've seen these scenarios we've presented before in the asset allocation discussion. Again, we came up with sort of a roughly 60-40 portfolio, the same one from the prior page, and said how would these have done during these periods of market stress? So here again, I'll focus just on the last one. And what you can see is for a number of the periods, the two more recent periods, yeah, it would have made sense. That portfolio would have delivered a slightly better return, but not significantly. I mean, 29.8 versus 30.1 decline, down 16.5 versus down 16.9. But the reality is, it's really only about half these scenarios where it would have done better. Actually, would have done worse. In the crash of '87, would have done worse. The stagflation of the 1970s. So it reduces volatility on average, but not in every scenario. So you'd have to be prepared for that. You also have to consider, okay, this would make you look different than your peers if you were to hedge your currency risk, because most of your peers do not hedge their currency risk. Some of them do, some hedge portions of it, but most do not. So we took a look at this, and the difference on average, again, hedging versus unhedging at a total portfolio level, is about 0.3% per year. So that's 30 basis points of additional tracking error per year you'd expect versus your peers. But that's the average. It has been as much as nearly 4% per year. So in any given year, even if you're expecting 0.3%, it could be 4% per year just due to a currency hedge versus your peer group. if you were to implement it, how would you go about doing it? There are a lot of different options. I've kind of condensed it on this page. One, you could, theoretically, staff could do this in-house. This requires significant infrastructure that you just heard from Funson. You aren't really set to have right now. Then you could obviously hire an external manager to do it for you. The most simple way is just have them do it passively. Say, we want you to hedge all of our EFI exposure in public equity markets. You just set up a rule, so it's rules-based. Agree to certain guidelines, about how often they're gonna hedge, how often they're gonna roll over those hedges. It's called tenor of the hedge in the footnote there. And it's gonna be fairly low cost. There will be a fee there, because that's gonna negate some of that benefit of hedging. But it's also not very flexible. I mean, it's a rule and it follows that rule. In theory, you could be semi-active. You could, and we've seen this with one of our other clients who they tend to hedge, but they agree with the currency manager. If there are certain currencies they don't want to hedge because they have a view on that currency or more than one currency, then maybe they take off that hedge. Or it could be outright active. You could, there are some currency managers that will be outright active and essentially take tactical views. At that point, it's really no longer hedging. It's taking an active risk.
Yeah, just, I guess, Jeff, maybe a question is for you, is since our investments are outside managers, do we have any significant amount of assets that we manage internally that are non-US? So I guess the vast majority would have to be managed by outside managers. And do we have an active conversation with them in terms of the amount of hedging that they do that would directly affect us with our investments outside the US?
So there's a lot in that question.
Yeah.
Let me unpack that. We have exposure in a number of ways. We have it in the overlay and removing currency that we have affirmatively put on in order to mimic having actual securities in those markets. That would be an easy thing for us. Another thing, so we have some index managers. And I believe that, and I'll defer to Brian if I get this wrong, that we can sign up for a version of those strategies where they have the currency hedging going on, but it's not a focus of ours right now. So the challenge that I see with hedging is figuring out a way to do it, basically pushing it into the mandate if we go down this path, so that we don't have to run this centralized hedging book that can create a considerable liquidity challenge for us. If hedging is not profitable and we're, whether we're doing it or we have a partner doing it, we would have to fund any losses in the hedging portfolio. So that would be a challenge for us, I think, in a world where we're trying to hold 1% cash. So, can we figure it out? Of course. I mean, we can spend time and figure out the way that if it is the desire of the commission to hedge a portion, we can figure that out. I don't want that to be the constraint. One other concern that I have, and this is something I feel very strongly about, is if we go down the path of wanting to hedge the portfolio, my personal preference would be that we would phase that in over a number of years, so that we are not going to sit there and say, okay, we went from unhedged to hedged now because it was painful, and then you would kind of logically assume that's not the best timing. So my argument would be, if this is something we want to do, this is something we pick a point out on the horizon and say, by the time we get there, we will have built a hedge program for X% of our developed non-US portfolio. We do have circumstances in our private markets portfolio where the part of the implementation is to hedge. So we need to kind of canvas through our portfolio to figure out precisely what do we believe would be candidate for hedging hedging what it would be a little less appropriate to hedge. I think Frank's outlined very clearly that for emerging markets, if you're gonna hedge that, you're kind of paying away a meaningful amount in order to do it. And it just makes the asset class cease to be as valuable to you. So I hope I'm hitting on a lot of the
If I understand you
points.
correctly, then if we are not in the mode of, we're not in the hedging procedure, or is that not our intent? And it is essentially up to the discretion of our managers?
Each manager would be different, and it would be, it was absolutely something that we cover in underwrite. So if I go back, how long we had Ernest, 6 years maybe. When we interview managers, we ask them, what is your approach to currency management? And some of them say, sometimes it's a part of our thesis, that we want this company, we don't want the attendant risk that comes from currency. So I think there's not really a blanket statement, but some managers may make that a part of what they do, some won't. Some don't, that's just, they don't feel they have an edge, so
All right,
they just won't
At
bother.
the end of the day, it all comes out in return. I mean, if you got managers that are hedging or not hedging, at the end of the day, it's gonna affect their.
Yeah, well, here's what I would have you kind of build an assumption around. I would have you think that we have about 20%, between 20 and 25% non-US currency, asset exposure, where the overwhelming majority of that is developed, non-emergent. We do have some emerging market debt that is dollar-denominated securities. So how do you feel the sensitivity of that type of strategy is to currency? It's even though they're dollar securities, that sensitivity is not zero. Ask Argentina, companies that issue historically in dollars, what it's like to fund obligations in dollars when your currency is deteriorating. So, but I don't want anyone to think this is 50% of our portfolio. Think of it in the kind of neighborhood of 22% of our portfolio having this type of currency risk to it. The overwhelming majority of it coming straight from our public
Essentially,
equity
we
book.
do not have it is not a investment policy.
Correct.
To hedge.
Correct.
Non-US dollar investments.
Exactly.
So to this point, we've talked mostly about sort of the benefits, volatility. Jeff just started talking about the challenges, and he's hit on a couple of points that I have up here. The first one I mentioned, it's gonna make you look different from your peers. So it's gonna add additional tracking error versus your peer group. Second, it is going to also cause tracking error or divergence from your benchmark. It might require changes to your benchmark. It makes those benchmarks hard to calculate. It also makes performance attribution much harder to calculate for staff. And I don't know if Mr. King is still in the room or not. But it adds complexity in-house. It can be challenging to explain to your stakeholders, whether the ones across the street, or the people receiving the checks, to explain how a currency hedge works and why you're doing it. The point Jeff made, the last two are the ones Jeff made. First one, bad experience with timing. The idea that a lot of people have historically implemented a hedge at that point where they had just experienced maximum pain from not having a hedge. And if you then put it in place, it's just traditional, buying high, selling low, just human behavior, we tend to do this. You would want to avoid that. You'd want to start your program in a way that avoids doing that. The last one is that added complexity, and Jeff mentioned this particular, needing to manage the liquidity around that. If you've got swaps, futures, you're going to need to manage the margin calls around that, make sure you have adequate cash on hand. It is some added complexity for the fund. And then honestly, at the end of the day, it's these reasons are the reasons why not every institutional investor has gone ahead and done this. Because from an academic standpoint, if you're just looking at gee, does it make sense to hedge my developed market exposure in isolation? Yes. When you add all these other things into it, it's enough to give you pause, or at least think, okay, we're interested in it, but we need to think this through and what's the most sense for us in terms of if we were to do it, how would we do it? And that's really the conclusions that we have on here. Again, you could probably get some risk reduction out of it, better risk-adjusted returns. I'll skip down to the last bullet on that page. You know, the key one is it just doesn't make sense. I mean, even though emerging market currency volatility is much higher, the cost of hedging it just doesn't make sense to do it for emerging markets. If you're going to do it at all, you do it where it is not cost prohibitive, so you do it with developed markets. More importantly, might be recommendations to you. Number one, we don't recommend this as something that you would do tactically. We don't recommend that you try and make currency bets. That if you were to do this, you would engage in a strategic hedge, and that you do it just for developed markets because emerging markets are so much more expensive to hedge. Because you have dedicated investment staff, you have multiple options for hedging, and because you have different ways of getting exposure to non-US markets, you have multiple options for how to implement a hedge, when to do it, what's more complicated and what's not. Note that this would require constant monitoring. So for all these reasons, what we recommend is that you explore this further with staff in Makita. That it makes sense that, okay, this could make sense for the portfolio. You know, Jeff has started to walk through some of the high-level things here. There's some of the issues we need to think about, how we would do it, you know, if it would make sense for you, given your portfolio, and what's feasible and over what time frame. Any questions?
How meaningful do you think the impact on, you know, because we do care how we perform in the peer group, how meaningful do you think this is against the backdrop of that? There's a lot of vol, but not really an expected over time change. And we tend to not look at peer rankings, but for 1-year periods.
So we get back to this chart. The difference on average has been 30 basis points per year, but it could be as much as 300 or 400 basis points in a given year versus that peer group, which is
400 basis points.
that last 3.9% per year.
Gotta get that one right.
Yes, that's a positive tracking error is a good thing there. But you can see, it looks like 2003, you know, the unhedged portfolio, that's probably the 300 basis points there. But that's if you, again, fully hedged, you know, that exposure, that EFI exposure. If you did it for only half your portfolio, then again, it brings that number down, which is something maybe you want to have in mind. Like, do you want to be even 200 basis points different than your peers just due to having a currency hedge in place?
I should have handled this with you before, but is 300 or 30 basis points the absolute value of the average, or if 1 year is you outperform by 50, the next year you underperform by 50, it averages to 0?
No, it averages to 50.
Okay,
Sorry.
all right.
Absolutely, Alex, right there.
Is there a public pension group that has really excelled by hedging? Someone we could look at a peer that's done well hedging?
Can I ask it slightly differently?
Yeah.
That is stuck with it for a very long time. Also. That I think is the other component is, as we think about turnover, you know, with term limited commissioners, how easy is it to stick with it?
Yeah, and you look at this chart, it looks like from around 2010 up until about 2015, there's 5 years where it was better off being unhedged. I mean, could you stand that pain of being unhedged? I know of at least one other public plan where for probably the first 2.5 years that we were, at was overlap with this period, that we were on board with them, the conversation at every meeting tended to be dominated by that currency decision. And in their case, it's because they were also semi-active. You know, they took that position of, we're gonna hedge, but maybe we won't hedge one or two of these currencies because we have a view on them. And tended to dominate.
That won't be a
conversation.
problem with us.
But it was a conversation of, gee, does it still make sense to have this hedge in place? And it dominated the conversation, which, again, if you're trying to be more strategic, that's not a conversation you probably want to be having at every meeting.
You know, it almost seems to me that after listening to all this, that the bottom line is, just let's keep on doing what we're doing and not try to outsmart. I mean, you can make all sorts of arguments and counter arguments in terms of what's likely to happen with the currencies. I mean, on the one hand, in Europe, you got what appears to be some slowing economies. On the other hand, the European Central Bank is withdrawing its stimulus to try to bring, which should theoretically bring rates up, yet they have a very low inflation rate. On the other hand, our rates are going up. So, I mean, you know, who's to figure it all out?
And that's why we would recommend any tactical decisions, because it's very hard for us to figure out. If you were to do this, it would be, let's set up a program, make it rules-based, and follow that for the long term. You know, sticking with, that's why you want it to be a well-thought-out, well-discussed, you know, recommendations. So they say, okay, we have conviction in this, and so that when that next generation of commissioners comes on board, they can say, okay, here's why we did this and why we'd want to stick with it.
Maybe I could propose something that is be a slight change to our work, and of course it would fall on the shoulders of our reporting team, which I have no problem with. So perhaps we should, just in order to kind of advance, but be mindful of currency for a while, specifically note the component of our policy benchmark return from having the foreign currency exposure, and you just kind of observe over time what this is. Because I think we continue to, we're just naturally drawn to this as a problem when having the foreign currency exposure has hurt. But I think it would behoove us, or we could have them map it out historically and just kind of show us the.
I was gonna suggest is, let's back test it using a few of these different methods. That didn't create a bunch of work for somebody, did it?
Of course it did, but don't worry, we're okay with that. That's what we do. Hopefully David King is listening and already working on it.
I mean, mine would say, I mean, we ought to know where the benchmarks are, right? Because we've gone to a global equity benchmark. So, I mean, in essence, what's our neutral weight? I mean, I'm generally, in terms of plan level, you know, you let managers, if they're active, right? Or if you did an overlay, because then you're essentially adding leverage, right? I mean, it's an easy form of leverage or a different return stream, but that's a different reason to do it than I don't like what's base-wise flowing through, right? And you let the companies figure it out. I mean, companies are good at this, right? I mean, they got assets on the ground in those places. I think to Ed's point, we can make it too complicated at ours. So I'm generally against it, right? We ought to know what kind of effect it's going to have just because of the benchmarks we're using. But if we were going to do something, I would say do it as an overlay and just admit it for what it is. It's a way to add leverage to the plan without really having to have financing leverage in the sense, right? Because you can hire managers and give them a pool of assets and they can sit there and bet all day long, right? You know.
So it's easy for me to promise work from others, but we'll come up with a way of looking at this. We'll, you know, in partnership with Frank and Aaron, and you know, I think what probably makes sense is some written output for commissioners to review. And again, we can decide if we want to bring this back up during our big strategy meeting in February.
Yeah.
I don't think it should take us too long. to
Yeah,
have
what I'd like to see is rather than, it's sort of a mixed issue, right? I mean, we're looking at the currency component, but whether there's not a better way, because a lot of our exposure winds up coming in passively. But I do think in emerging markets and other stuff, there are real index construction issues, right? I mean, you take China, it's a big market, but it's largely state-owned enterprises, right? I think there's a reasonable, rational, secular, long-term reason to believe that state-owned enterprises are not gonna behave the same way as private, enterprises do, right? Whether they're here, or whether they're in China, they're gonna fundamentally behave differently because they have different incentives, right? You saw the same thing in Brazil, right? Petrobras became a big-ass jobs program, and it was the bulk of their index, and it crashed their index, but very unique, state-owned enterprise, right? So I say that I think, even though we're talking about in terms of currency, I think the bigger question is whether in these markets there truly is an index construction issue that's worth thinking through on a long-term secular basis, because these markets do have a lot more state-owned enterprises and actors, right? And you get quite different behavior.
It's true. I will note that the largest drivers of market cap growth in China have been Tencent and Alibaba.
Yeah.
Which are definitely not state-owned.
Right.
But doesn't it almost seem that the currency hedging aspect of investing outside the US is almost secondary to the decision to invest there in the first place? If you like emerging markets, well then you really almost as a corollary feel like you don't need to hedge, or not necessarily. But it just seems to me that the crucial decision as to whether you want to be there in the first place. And the currency aspect is really almost secondary.
Yeah. The other aspect, and this is something that when we did currency hedging as one of our challenging beliefs exercises, one of the things that we looked at is that incremental return and whether or not that has factor sensitivity to major risks in our portfolio, or is it in fact a form of volatility that effectively diversifies those other key risks? So, it's been a while since we've looked at that, but I think that we can provide some additional depth to the conversation. But, and if there's some aspect of this that you'd like us to look at beyond this, obviously we'll embrace it. So.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. This certainly adds to the Commissioner Education part of what we do, and it is very helpful to us, and it helps me gradually get over my U.S. bias, which I struggle with, but I still have a few nagging concerns that I'll continue to talk about.
You have some very distinguished company. As I understand, John Bogle says he wouldn't invest outside the U.S. Everything he invested is in the U.S. He sees no reason to invest outside the U.S.
Yeah,
and I think, doesn't the guy in Omaha say basically the same thing?
Yeah, but I mean, it's a little bit different implementation. I had this conversation with the board just this week, right? Like, one of the best stories, right, is, Japan was the second largest market, and, they trade at half, but Toyota would have been one of the best companies you could have bought at that time. But if you look at their corporate balance sheet in 1990, it was almost all Japanese yen-based assets, whereas today it's almost all US dollar assets that are here. And so they just, as a corporate management team, did a great job getting out of the country effectively, right? They essentially moved the company. So I think you can get away with it if you have a portfolio of the right management teams, right? And if you go to corporate events, I can tell you management teams are moving their money out of this country into emerging markets. I mean, I was just there. Honeywell's main guy for growth sits in Shanghai and is talking about Indonesia, right? I mean, that's what
Alan, is that a function more of the tariffs and trade thing, or is that?
No, I mean, I think the tariffs and trade thing to a degree, you know, some of that depends on where they sit and what products they're in, but manufacturing, I mean, they've been saying this for 10, 15 years, that they realize supply lines, they're gonna manufacture stuff on every continent, right? And they're kind of, and Michelin realized that 15 years ago, that they were gonna have stuff going on every continent. It does change kind of what parts they're moving around and shipping around and assembly type of stuff. Right, I think it's just where they see the growth, where they see the demographics. It depends kind of on their product, right? But if you look at where Intel's corporate dollars go, they go to emerging markets, right? If you look at Honeywell and you listen to them, they're just more and more assets are going that way. Now, I think the question with the tariffs and stuff is ultimately, do they keep them in one company, right? You saw Philip Morris split itself into two, into international and domestic, right? And this gets a little bit into state actor things. You saw Booz Allen, right? They split government from commercial, right? So, I mean, I think at an individual company level, you see different boards. But when I say that, I mean, that gets back to, are we doing a index approach to it? Or are we hiring managers, you know, or, you know, putting money in actual securities where these decisions are happening at a different level, right? So I think there can be a little bit of a disconnect sometimes when we're doing stuff at an index level or a passive level versus people like Buffett who are making an active decision on a company and a management team to allow them to make that determination, right? I mean, it's a little bit different animal, I think.
All right. Mr. Chairman, the next matter is our delegated investment report, which, as you can see here, since the June meeting, we did close on 7 investments that are listed here. And we have provided a lot of information to you, particularly during the closing process, but also the recorded materials we provided. We'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any, but you know, we thought we would accelerate the meeting and spare you the next hour and a half of presentation by presentation review of these. But we are happy to answer any questions about any of these, if there are any.
I think you and I we discussed this on the call, but I just bring it up again because I think it's a crucial question, is that in any of our managers who are doing any sort of lending, whether it be direct, indirect, high grade, low grade, whatever, we've all seen the spread contract appreciably between high grade and low grade, and we're at this low point, which is a warning. And the thing that concerns me is at this point, over the recent past, where we've seen really low quality companies issuing massive amounts of debt with virtually no covenants. And to me, that's just, why would we do anything like that? We should have no part of that stuff whatsoever. That's an invitation to disaster.
So there are strategies on this list that are lending strategies, but they are not the flavor that you are fearful of. They are specifically the Owl Rock First Lien Fund, first lien, safer place in the stack. We look for, you know, better yields and covenants, frankly, in the flavors of direct lending that we're participating in, but also the KKR Lending Partners 3 fund that we did. But if you want more detail on that, we can ask Steve Marino. But yeah, we share your sentiment, and we're not heartened by what we see particularly in the listed credit space right now, where the spreads are is, they blew out in October, as you would expect, but they are very tight, and it is very difficult to get appropriate covenant protection. So we share your sentiments 100%.
On the man numeric, since that's a pretty large fraction of the assets of the plan, would that be placed very quickly
I'll defer to Brian Moore.
Yeah, so the approval is for up to 1%, so that's about $300 million. We funded that in tranches over a period of 3 months. So, because the market's not liquid, not as liquid, so emerging markets, there's some illiquidity issues just in emerging markets in general. Going down a level in the small cap, you want to be measured in how you fund that commitment. So, we funded in tranches of $100 million, I believe, starting in July, and then we did $100 million in August, and then we did another 25 million in September.
So, good instincts. That is a lot of money to send into a market that's hard to get money to work.
Yeah, and one of the added points to that is that the market is very difficult to get capacity in. So a lot of the strategies that we saw in the space, once they get a 3-year track record, they tend to close because they close at $500 million to $1 billion of AUM. So for us to get a large commitment with a high conviction manager was actually pretty difficult. This was a group we knew already from the International Small Cap Search.
See, there's a lot from September and October and even early November, so the great unpleasantness of October, hopefully we will be able to exploit. So it's one of those things that we, sometimes it works in your favor, so.
And would you remind me of what our upper limit is on
the things that are illiquid? So if you think about liquidity, and liquidity in 90 days or more is at this point 75 basis points on plain value.
233 million.
Yes, 233 million. So, and things that are liquid would be up to 2% of plan assets.
2%, okay.
So 666. It's a bad number.
Okay.
It's a longer list than normal, but we didn't get an opportunity to share what had been in flight at the September meeting. So we are showing you what's been done since the last full meeting we had.
Right. Yeah, just emphasis on we did not do all this since the September meeting.
Yes.
Comments, questions about the delegated investments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeff?
Executive session now, Mr. Chairman.
May I have a motion to move into executive session? So moved.
Can we state the reasons why we're really going into executive session to discuss investment matters pursuant to SC Code Section 91680 and 916.320 to discuss personnel matters related to the CEO's review of the CIO performance and the CEO performance and compensation pursuant to SC Code Section 30-4-70A1 and to receive advice from legal counsel pursuant to SC Code Section 30-4-70A2.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Unanimous.
Mr. Chairman, you've risen out of executive session, so just for purposes of the record, I want to say that the commission did not take any reportable action while in executive session, and any action that did occur while in executive session pursuant to SC Code annotated Section 916-80 and 916.320 will be publicized when doing so would not jeopardize the commission's ability to achieve its investment objectives or implement a portion of the annual investment plan.
Thank you. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
I'll say you were first, you were second.
Thank you, thank you.